Chapter 5:26 Abandoned. They had no idea how they had managed to break out of the transportation tower, but they had. It had been an arduous and bloody battle to make it back, but they had done so without casualties. At least in their party. Earlier, when the yellow cube had been claimed, then rendered inoperable by the horde of digesters crawling on its surface, many had lost all hope for a short time. After hacking their way to the top through the sea of monsters, the grand conclusion had crushed the spirits of most of the survivors. Yet, even without motivation and filled with deep pessimism, it was not enough to threaten the well-being of Jake and his companions. Regardless of Mufasa and Shere Khan providing protection, even Will was able to defend himself for some time against digesters of this level. By mutual agreement, the survivors had all decided to evacuate from the skyscraper, making their way back to the edge of the city. This would not allow them to escape completely, but at least the sheer density and level of digesters around them would be greatly reduced. With many more casualties, the various groups of survivors managed to get out of the danger zone, finally getting the breathing room they needed. Among these survivors was Shackler's group of several dozen evolvers of the same pachydermic species as himself, as well as many minions and slaves of various species, though with very few humans. Another prominent group was obviously the one of Buzzcock and Maeve, whose close guard of powerful evolvers deterred anyone from approaching them. The number of third and fourth ordeal players was not small, and from the glare the barbarian was giving him and Kyle, if not for the urgency of the situation, he would have certainly ordered them to rip them apart. A third group of comparable magnitude was Melkri's faction. Will and Svara had recognized several of her agents among them. And although the overall strength of this group was slightly less than the previous two, they were no less formidable. Surprisingly, although this group was mostly composed of bipedal or quadrupedal aliens with bestial features, Melkri, their leader, had an overall human appearance. She was a young woman of small size with yellow eyes, long floppy ears, and long wavy light green hair. She was rather cute with her well-endowed curves and flawless skin, at least what they could see of it with all the grime. But her style of dress and personal hygiene clearly left something to be desired. Besides exposing her yellow teeth every time she smiled, testifying to her questionable dental hygiene, her pale skin was covered with mud or dried clay, while she wore only a long, shapeless dress woven from some vegetable fiber. The whole thing was rough and unsightly and reeked of poverty and savagery. It was hard to believe that she was the leader of the third largest faction in an oracle shelter. Fortunately, in addition to these three influential groups, there were also many other influential evolvers in the area. Each oracle city in the oracle playground was connected to multiple shelters through its orange cubes, and this automatically meant that Buzzcock, Shackler, and Melkri were only able to monopolize a very small portion of the city estates. There were still evolvers before whom they had to show their respect. What do we do now? Will inquired with a sullen look while darting his eyes all around them. He was keeping his cool, but he was still concerned. In the meantime, they had finally reached the edge of the city, and one of the transfer squares usually covered with orange cubes was in their sights. Noticing that there weren't that many digesters there and that the cubes were still glowing, an idea dawned on him, and he proposed, while pointing. "Let's go over there. We'll have a better chance of escaping than by sticking out here." If Jake could come to this conclusion, so could the other groups. To reach and conquer this oracle city, these digesters had to have invaded the place from somewhere. Therefore, it was perfectly normal that these orange cubes were ignored, since they had probably used them to get here. As for the yellow cube in the center of the city, it wasn't necessarily the digesters that had disabled it, but perhaps a security measure foreseen by the oracle system to prevent their proliferation. The only consolation was that following this logic, Buzzcock's oracle shelter from which they came might not have been doomed yet. These digesters could very well have come here through the orange cubes of another shelter. As Kyle watched them make their way to the plaza, he thought very hard, what about my sister? But he finally shut up as he saw that Buzzcock and his gang were following them. According to their respective shelter locations, the various factions began to split up to try to find their squares, and after a few polite goodbyes, only Buzzcock, Shackler, and Melkri's groups, and a few independent evolvers were left. As the three leaders pressured him to go first, Jake ignored them and placed his hand over one of the orange cubes. His figure and that of his comrades disappeared immediately, reappearing the next second in the familiar hall of the Oracle playground. Jake immediately frowned as he surveyed the place. The place was as clean and well lit as ever, but there was something in the air that felt different. Testing his shadow guide again, he noticed that here too it was dysfunctional. So he opted for a wide scan, and the result was very unpleasant. Prepare to fight, he murmured grimly as he quickly forged a new sword by scraping the steel covering the walls. Given the malleability and strength of this alloy, this second weapon promised to be superior to his first creation. Meanwhile, the three factions of Buzzcock, Shackler, and Melcree soon followed them here, and the hall was soon crowded. Jake was pleased when he recognized Grash among them. He must have joined them while Jake and his group were scouting here. No enemies? They probably fled when they heard I was back. Buzzcock snorted dismissively as he scanned the hall with his eyes. His men, but especially the female slaves still alive, were quick to compliment him and praise his wisdom. Maeve was no exception. It was interesting to note that Buzzcock valued his sexual fulfillment more than money or power. Of the 94 evolvers still alive in his group, 16 were his sex slaves. With his propensity to devour them whenever he was hurt or in a bad mood, this was by no means a small number. Jake and his companions rolled their eyes without hiding their contempt while listening to his comment. Who was the guy earlier who forced them to come here first out of cowardice? It was a typical example of bullying the weak and fearing the strong. In comparison, Shackler and Melcree were more tactful, but they were no less hateful. Shackler in particular had the pompous arrogance of upper-class aristocracy, combined with a deep racism and sense of superiority towards species other than his own. Although he had no desire for these female slaves, he had no qualms about enslaving them and prostituting them for his own personal gain. Only Melcree could barely be considered okay morally speaking. Luckily, not everyone was as haughty as Buzzcock, and several evolvers took note of the vigilant attitude of Jake's group. They drew their weapons without hesitation. Faced with this change in atmosphere, those who had been a little too relaxed dropped their cocky smiles and got into fighting position. Without paying them any attention, Jake had already telepathically transmitted his instructions, and he and his companions began their advance toward the entrance of the building. Their proactive attitude earned them the favorable opinion of many evolvers, especially those who lacked confidence. Of course, this was all for show. With his scan, he knew exactly where the digesters were, and his attitude was only meant to relax Buzzcock's vigilance. If he found an opportunity to kill him, he would not hesitate. Mufasa and Shere Khan had already offered to deal with him several times, but he had firmly refused. With their current predicament, it was best to preserve their strength for the time being. As anticipated by his scan, when they left the building, Jake and his group found the inner shelter as quiet as when they left. Behind the force field separating them from the outer shelter, a tide of refugees and tents were packed in, still waiting for a chance to leave this cursed place. The moans of pleasure and pain from the Red District still reached their ears, while the hubbub of merchants, refugees, and other evolvers trading and chatting had not abated. However, Jake was not fooled by this peaceful environment. He soared to the top of the transportation tower in the center of the shelter, which was much smaller than the previous one, and confirmed what he had been dreading. The yellow cube there had already been deactivated, and the inhabitants were not yet aware of it. Peering through the deformed and translucent walls of the black cube supposed to protect them, Jake saw only a gray and dull world outside the shelter, but with his Murtharian sight, he also detected some worrying shadows. Reanalyzing the results of the previous scan, he was able to validate his previous observations. Since their departure, the digesters had infiltrated the place, and the Oracle had already abandoned them. Chapter 5:27 Deep Scheme. When he met his comrades down below, Jake looked glum. His face spoke volumes, and neither Will nor Svara asked him any questions. As for Kyle, he was too busy healing his wounds to worry about their future troubles. While Jake and his group were thinking of a plan, the other factions also sent scouts to inspect the transportation tower, and each of them came back with the same defeated and depressed expression. A dark and desperate mood soon set in among the survivors. Yet they did not leave the inner shelter. Buzzcock and Shackler may have had a large number of subordinates in the outer shelter, but it had long been infiltrated by many digesters. Jake and his group had no reason to cross the force field and expose themselves to unnecessary risk. There's something that's been bothering me for a while, Jake said after a while pacing around. Once Buzzcock and the other factions had pulled away from them, they had finally decided to head to the outer shelter to regroup their forces and increase their chances of survival. If they could also eliminate the undercover digesters, it would kill two birds with one stone. What do you mean? The eyes of Will, Svara, and a few of the felines lit up as they saw him come out of his daze. Remember when Sarah's floating island was swamped by those space digesters? Jake reminded them calmly. Will and Kyle nodded their heads as they recalled that tragic incident. If their reaction was initially lukewarm, a flash of understanding struck them the next instant. The explosion! They both exclaimed with shock. Jake responded with a big smile as he saw their enthusiasm. That's right. The yellow cube on her island self-destructed as a safety precaution. He acknowledged their reasoning while pointing to the dim yellow cube on top of the transportation tower. If it's not a digester's trick, my guess is that the Oracle hasn't given up on this place yet. Deactivating these cubes is just a temporary measure to discourage these creatures. How so? Svara asked with a question mark on her face. Aside from training and fighting, she usually didn't care about such complicated things, and the felines who shared this personality trait were greatly appreciative of her initiative. Digesters are attracted to ether sources. Will completed the explanation. If the ether core is deactivated or at least its etheric signature is hidden, we can assume that the cubes are no longer appealing to these low-level digesters. Only low-level digesters, though. Kyle grunted as he tested the strength of his freshly healed leg. To his oomph of pain, he still had quite a bit of work to do to restore it perfectly. Will grimaced, I also don't think this tactic will work forever. Jake nodded uneasily. It worked because these low-level digesters are too stupid to do sophisticated thinking. To them, these cubes and us aren't that different. We're still sources of ether and nutrients. But if more advanced and intelligent digesters show up here, I have no doubt that they will know what to do with these yellow cubes. At that point, I'll be surprised if the yellow cube doesn't explode, dragging down the shelter and us with it. I'm not thrilled with that reasoning, but it makes sense. A deep, raspy voice with a heavy accent sounded behind them. Turning in the direction of the noise, Jake and the others spotted the gigantic humanoid boar figure of Grash. Despite his good relationship with the giant, Jake immediately became wary as he saw the evolver approaching. After all, he was one of Buzzcock's men. No need to worry anymore. I've left his faction. Grash sighed as he stabbed the heavy sword into the ground before sitting down with a fresh canister of cleaning alcohol in his hand. Bringing it to his mouth, he gulped down the equivalent of 2 or 3 liters of the elixir in a few gulps before sadly revealing, "My brother is dead. I just shot him." Jake and the others showed a slight surprise at the news. They weren't familiar with him at all except for Jake, but even he didn't understand what such a revelation had to do with them or his withdrawal from the Buzzcock faction. As if he knew what was on their minds, Grash began to explain his purpose for being here and working with this Nawai chief. After listening carefully to his story, they gained a better understanding of his intentions. What an asshole! Kyle cursed through clenched teeth. He had stomped his foot so hard just now that he had almost broken the bones in his leg that had just barely knitted together. His hatred for the Nawai had already shot through the roof. Grash's story in a nutshell was pretty simple. Like Kyle and many other evolvers of varying degrees of talent and courage, he had faced and survived 5 ordeals without ever giving up hope of finding his people. Unlike the playboy, he had managed to get most of his relatives to safety, but his brother had suffered a fate similar to Maeve's, though far more enviable. His brother, after finding his brother, Grash, like Kyle, had tried to negotiate with Buzzcock, and fortunately, since he was not a woman or one of his sex slaves, they had signed an agreement that was acceptable to both parties. His arrival coincided with the dungeon digester incident, and the Nawai leader had eagerly offered to free his brother in exchange for 3 months of his service. Naively, Grash had agreed. A few minutes earlier, Grash had gone to visit his brother to bring him to safety, but instead made the awful discovery that his brother Grush was nothing more than an empty shell housing a digester parasite. This thing had his memories and behaved almost like him, but it was not his brother. With his experience and instincts, Grash immediately sensed that something was wrong and obliterated it on the spot. An evolver of his level had at least that degree of resolve. Unfortunately, That didn't make him any less sad and depressed. Even though his brother had been dead for some time, he still felt as if he had just slayed him with his own hands. With his brother dead, the contract he had signed with Buzzcock had become invalid, and he had left. Patting his back to console the giant, Jake couldn't help but ask him the crucial question. Do you have an estimate of how long your brother has been under the control of this brain-eater digester? Somewhat caught off guard and half drunk, Grash thought intensely as he squinted his eyes before answering in an uncertain tone. My brother was still alive 2 days ago, I'm sure of it. So it's all recent, Jake muttered, stroking his chin thoughtfully. That's consistent with the fact that we didn't notice anything during our previous visit. Will said with a serious expression. That's not exactly good news. Indeed, it reeked of an end-of-the-world plot. If the digesters had invaded the shelter a long time ago, it would have been paradoxically reassuring. It would have meant that they needed time to build up their numbers here. But if all of this had happened in the last few hours, then they were in far greater danger than they imagined. To pick up on your earlier discussion about the yellow cube, Grash stated suddenly as he remembered what they were discussing when he arrived. There is one obvious thing you didn't mention. The yellow cube is momentarily disabled, not destroyed or dysfunctional. We can't use it to leave, but if necessary the Oracle can still use it to get more evolvers here. Based on my experience, help should arrive sooner or later if the Oracle hasn't abandoned this place. How can you be so sure of that? Kyle asked with some doubt. Grash laughed, seeming to recover surprisingly well from his brother's death. Maybe it was a racial trait or just his personality. You two will know all these things after you finish your fourth ordeal. He confessed in a mysterious tone. This may be the first time I've been trapped in a dungeon digester, but I know everything there is to know about it. I and all the other evolvers who have completed their fourth ordeal have been briefed at length on the subject. Buzzcock and the others are also in the know. Jake and Will's faces darkened as they heard this. It meant that despite their apparent panic, none of these faction leaders were ignorant about what was going on. It was only them and the other refugees who were kept in the dark. Chapter 528 Chaos. I don't like where it's going, Kyle blurted out after a short silence. Me neither, Svara chipped in with a wry smile. The felines refrained from commenting, but from the intense discontent shining in their eyes, they fully shared this opinion. Refusing to leave his fate in the hands of others, Jake scanned the shelter again, and his eyebrows narrowed even more. I don't think we'll have a chance to bet on help coming, he said with a rueful look as he shared with them the results of the area scan. As he read the report, each of his companions felt a sense of urgency. The number of digesters in the outer shelter had nearly doubled since their arrival here, while the number of refugees had decreased by the same amount. Despite these distinct changes, there had been no commotion or bustle to accompany these developments. With the arrival of the three factions leaders trying to regroup their troops, skirmishes should logically have broken out everywhere. They did erupt, but they were in the minority. As long as these digesters were not part of their men, these leaders would not care about these creatures. I think we should take the opportunity to do the same, Will suggested hesitantly. He wasn't a fan of the idea, but it was his job as a tactician to speak out. Jake and the others immediately understood what he was getting at. Although they knew nothing about the dungeon digesters, a relative truth of this universe was that there was strength in numbers. Even if the majority of the refugees were unambitious cowards doomed to be cannon fodder, they could reduce the enemy load focused on them, and perhaps even save their lives by providing a diversion in a critical moment. Ethically speaking, this was a questionable strategy, but by leaving these refugees to fend for themselves, their chances of survival were zero anyway. By taking them under their wing, they were at least giving them a chance, and it was an opportunity to recruit. Who knows? Some of them might find their balls during this ordeal and become valuable recruits. Well, they weren't really counting on it. You have a faction, Grash. A fifth ordeal player would be most welcome among them. Their faction was in dire need of such a powerhouse. No thanks, I'm not interested at the moment. I'm fine on my own, Grash replied honestly, looking at him oddly. Oh, that's okay. Jake didn't insist, but inwardly he was somewhat disappointed. He quickly shook off that feeling of disappointment, though, aware that the alien's attitude was completely normal. After all, they had only known each other for a few hours and did not fully trust each other. But above all, they were on the weak side. Without knowing the precise details of their faction, an evolver of his level had no reason to join them. If he knew how rich Jake was, he might have reasoned differently. Let's go rescue those refugees then. Will refocused on the topic, but didn't try to convince the alien either. From experience, he knew better than to force this kind of thing. Once they had made their decision, they wasted no time. Splitting up into groups again, they reformed the previous teams, this time leaving Kyle with Will and Shere Khan to give him time to heal. Mufasa, Duchess, and Svara formed another team of their own. As for Jake, Crunch, and Thomas O'Malley, the cheetah, stayed with him, this time with the addition of Grosh. No one objected. If the outer shelter looked peaceful behind the force field marking the border of the inner shelter, the reality was quite different once the barrier was crossed. While chaos had not yet erupted, the disappearance of the refugees and the presence of the digesters had finally been noticed, and panic was beginning to set in. The faction leaders' movements had not helped either, as they had made no real effort to conceal their intentions. The reason for their presence and the seriousness of their plight had already leaked out among the refugees. As Jake walked through the same cluster of slums he had visited a few hours earlier, his vision repeatedly caught sight of some of the refugees whose features he had memorized earlier. With his absolute memory and extreme acuity, it was childishly simple to detect anomalies in their behavior. In order not to cause a panic, Jake did not make any move to alarm these monsters, but unfortunately fate decided otherwise. Perhaps by coincidence, or because these digesters sensed his caution, but one of them acted out in front of a witness. He was a wizened, dirty, and severely gaunt man, like thousands of others in these slums, and he was just hugging his sick wife. Yet, when he brought his mouth to her lips, perhaps by instinct, she resisted weakly and pushed him back with her slender arms. In the midst of the action, a long grayish tongue resembling a lamprey was exposed for all to see, while the nightmarish appendage pooped a few weird black eggs not bigger than small pearls. If the witness had been an alien unfamiliar with human anatomy, perhaps no one would have noticed, but no luck, it was his son. Upon seeing this horrific scene, the child immediately began to bawl, drawing the attention of other humans in the vicinity. Like a series of falling dominoes, the ensuing chain reaction degenerated into total chaos in a matter of seconds. The child responsible for this was mauled mercilessly by his own father, while his mother became one of the monsters by being forced to ingest one of those black eggs. Familiar with this type of scenario after his third ordeal, Jake didn't panic like the others, quite the opposite. Instead, it removed the few qualms he had about taking action. With a few well-placed blows, he and Grosh smashed the brains of the possessed. A mush of brains and blood painted the place, but they didn't flinch. Crouching down next to their victims, they inspected the mush for the parasites. Finding their remains squashed as expected, Jake finally relaxed. Scanning these mini digesters that looked like large fleas with tentacles, Jake confirmed that they were indeed brain eaters, the digesters having compromised his first ordeal and reduced a glorious hero like Mermid to a helpless food pantry. Of course, these brain eaters were not the same ones he had encountered in the past. As with space digesters, they could take many forms and appearances, and their abilities varied accordingly. These monsters were not yet a serious threat. They might become one if given a few more days to evolve. At the same time, Jake heard gunshots and screams erupting far from the neighborhood where they were and realized that similar incidents were occurring throughout the outer shelter. Soon there would be utter chaos, playing right into the hands of the digesters. With no time to waste, Jake and Grosh ruthlessly eliminated all humans, animals, and possessed aliens in front of the stunned refugees. After clearing the area of the monsters within 200 meters, Jake channeled his strength ether into his vocal cords and formed a megaphone with his telekinesis to amplify his voice. "Don't panic," he shouted as he released the aura of his apex predator glyph. He immediately got the desired quiet and attention. "The shelter has been overrun by digesters, and the yellow cube has been temporarily disabled. There will be no rescue for the time being, so if you want to survive, I urge you to cooperate. If you have factions, family members, or friends to protect, please join them in a calm manner. If you have no one to rely on, you can follow me. Anyone who helps spread panic will be executed on the spot by my own hands. Choose your executioner, the digesters, or me." Jake himself cringed as he pronounced these threats of third-rate villains, but it was for the greater good. After his speech, The panic subsided noticeably, and most of the refugees regained their composure as they realized that they were not left to suffer on their own. A few of them, who were a little more clever and quick-witted than the others, ran up to him and greeted him with an oath of allegiance. It remained to be seen if their oath had any shred of authenticity in it, but it was certainly a better move than remaining undecided. At least on the surface, they had chosen a side. "I didn't think you were that charismatic," Grosh grumbled as he admired the audacity of this human. With a few sentences and a few kills, he had managed to pacify these fearful dimwits. After that, Jake repeated the procedure and moved from one area of the outer shelter to another until he finally reached the red district he had already visited. After eliminating another wave of digesters who were no longer trying to hide, he was surprised to bump into the red-headed former lawyer prostitute he had interviewed earlier. "Don't come any closer," she screamed in terror, stepping in front of her small children. When the monster was about to attack, she screamed reluctantly as she raised her dagger in front of her with her eyes closed, but was startled to feel no impact. When she opened her eyes again, she was pleasantly shocked to find the human who had made a strong impression on her a few hours earlier. The corpse of her assailant lay in 6 parts a few feet before her. Chapter 5:29 The Fourth Faction. Still in shock, her jaw quivered in astonishment before the young mother finally managed to stammer out a string of coherent words. "I'm still alive," she stuttered as she carefully inspected every nook and cranny of her body with growing disbelief. Seemingly forgetting something important, she tensed up and jerked her head around to check on her 2 sons. She was immensely relieved when she found that both children were frightened, but didn't have so much as a scratch on them. "Thank God you're okay," she sobbed as she pulled them into a tight hug. As they returned to the reassuring embrace of their mother's arms, the frazzled nerves of the 2 boys gave way, and they also melted into tears, bawling loudly. "Damn it, I hate brats," Grash groused as he scratched his head aggrievedly. Sensing the giant's disapproving gaze, the 2 kids stiffened and immediately stopped sobbing their heads off. Their mother also regained her composure. Bowing to Jake, she humbly thanked him. "You're welcome, but I didn't do it for you. It was just along the way," Jake retorted, remaining impassive. His principles hadn't changed. Anyone who wasn't willing to do what was necessary to survive didn't deserve his concern. "If you want to survive, you know my rules," he added before raising his voice for all to hear. "It's too late to get into a red cube and become self-sufficient warriors, but don't think you can run away from here without a fight. Even with the best of intentions, I can't protect you all against a tide of digesters. Heck, maybe I won't even survive all of this either. What I can do, instead, is give you a fair shot by making sure you don't have to face enemies you don't stand a chance against." Lifting his hand, a mental ripple radiated out from his body and spread in a 100 m radius. All the objects, devices, tools, ingots, ores, and other wreckage piling up in the nearby slums began to magically float over to him. As they converged towards his outstretched hand, their temperature increased sharply and a reddish glow began to emit from the materials. By the time they reached his hand, most of these objects had dissolved into a ball of molten metal. With the help of his metal control and telekinesis, Jake formed a large ball of molten steel right before him and began to fine-tune his control to extract the impurities and save himself a long tempering. The size of the glowing ball of metal decreased by 2, then 3, and Jake finally dropped a satisfied smirk. Wiggling his fingers like a skilled puppeteer, Jake then began to finely manipulate this molten metal to mold various bladed weapons. These were mostly long swords, axes, and spears of various sizes to fit different body types. Once shaped, he absorbed the heat inside his body and let them fall to the ground with a loud clang. His first batch of weapons completed, Jake waved his hand with a grandiloquent air, and with a generous expression, he said, "These weapons are yours. From now on, these weapons will be your best allies, so choose wisely." "Really charismatic," Grash muttered in a low voice as he observed the scene. The truth was that inwardly he was rather impressed. This evolver may have been weaker than he was, but the versatility of his talents had already baffled him. Compared to this human, he had only his Herculean strength to rely on. These weapons were not outstanding, but they were still of much better quality than the ones usually sold to them at high prices in the outer shelter. It was worth noting that not all aliens were from advanced civilizations like those on Earth. While there were indeed species that outclassed Earthlings technologically and biologically, such as the Nosks and Silverzorians, there were also many that were stuck in the Stone Age. These generally intellectually limited aliens like the Nawai males and other even dumber creatures were usually ripped off at every turn by the other species if they didn't have enough strength to compensate for this handicap. When they were too stupid or naive, sometimes even strength wasn't enough. Grash's rusty greatsword and plate armor was clear evidence of this. Even after 5 ordeals, his intelligence clearly still didn't allow him to escape these kinds of shady traps, or he wouldn't be out there proudly boasting about drinking cleansing alcohol as if it were an exceptional vintage. Jake was still looking forward to meeting this extraordinary hustler. Seeing all these freshly cast weapons, the crowd of refugees was momentarily stunned by such a demonstration of magic, but this only increased their respect and admiration for this strange human. Those who had already pledged their allegiance to him hesitated only a moment before rushing for the weapons. Without drawing attention to himself, an old man in his 80s limped determinedly to a long steel spear and picked it up before wielding it expertly. Good weapon. His misty eyes sparkled with a strange light as he examined the weapon. Who are you? Jake asked warily, noticing the old man's suspicious demeanor. I was a slave until a few minutes ago, but it seems I've changed masters. The old man replied, looking at him strangely, yet with obvious gratitude. Jake understood what was going on as he sensed his gratefulness. Inspecting his list of contracts, he noticed that several names had indeed been added to the list. He then noticed that most of the refugees who had rushed to pick up a weapon and pledge their allegiance to him were precisely those whose slave contracts had been transferred to him. By killing their former masters under digester control, he had become their new owner. Very well. Jake accepted the old man's resolution. If you are determined to fight, I will give you your freedom once we get out of here. The refugees with a master still alive wore envious expressions as they heard this promise. They would surely have to fight anyway. This promise was better than struggling without hope. How good would it be if their masters could be killed too? The pile of weapons was quickly cleaned out by the refugees. There wasn't enough for all of them, but not everyone had the ambition to fight on the front line. Like everywhere else in the world, there were also selfish bullies hogging the best weapons, but that was not his problem. If even in the face of such a windfall they couldn't find it in themselves not to get stepped on, then they would never find it. Jake then continued to tour the outer shelter, meticulously clearing each area of his undercover digesters. After each intervention, the line of refugees behind him grew steadily longer, until more than 3,000 humans, animals, and aliens were standing beside him, placing all their hope in him. Each time, he would take the time to make a new batch of weapons, adapting to the characteristics of the different species present. Even the chickens and ducks got their own equipment. One could see them clucking and cackling along with their funny helmets. Crunch, who had been so magnificently quiet up to now, made no secret of his jealousy when he saw that even a hen was entitled to more generous treatment than he was. Rubbing his big furry head against his master while purring like a V12 engine, he showed him his best puppy eyes. Too bad, he didn't really have the size and cuteness potential of a kitten anymore. Fuck off. Jake kicked him mercilessly when the intruder interrupted his grandiloquent speech for the 3rd time. He was barely starting to dabble in politics that his cat was already trying to screw up his career. With a hurt pout, Crunch gave him a resentful look before waddling off to lick his wounds. Feeling suddenly guilty, Jake cursed the cat's shamelessness before snapping. Fine, you win. Digging into his own supply of metals that he had scraped from the walls of the Oracle playground, Jake formed a new ball of molten lava and carved a set of armor in no time for his cat. Given his haste, the result was barely passable, if not ugly as fuck, but Crunch finally stopped sulking in his corner. Now Crunch just looked like a brilliant white knight cat, and that was just ridiculous. But at least the feline was happy. Thomas O'Malley, his cheetah buddy, was clearly envious, and that was more than enough to boost his vanity. The rescue mission resumed again, and Jake and his growing group proceeded to wipe out the digesters and recruit the refugees until an unavoidable event forced him to stop. There were no more refugees to rescue, nor digesters to slaughter. At that moment, Jake and his army stared down the largely repopulate factions of Buzzcock, Shackler, and Melcree with intense vigilance. The four major factions were finally gathered together to decide what to do next. Sweeping his gaze over the thousands of bedraggled refugees behind Jake and Grosh, Buzzcock was inwardly seething with rage, but he didn't show it. "You're more resourceful than I thought, I must admit." The Nawai leader acknowledged his mistake, but it was only to better retaliate. Not finding the other rat, he taunted, "Where is Maeve's brother that you saved? Not dead, I hope. I still have to show him how I express my love to his sister." Chapter 5:30 Expedition. "I'm right here, motherfucker." Turning his head in a certain direction, Buzzcock recognized the runt he had tortured moments earlier. Except this time he wasn't alone. Another frail human, as well as a huge tiger, a baby dragon, and several other imposing felines, accompanied him. The presence of the other human was negligible, but the other creatures could not be ignored, especially the gigantic tiger. His instincts warned him against this creature that did not look like much behind its false sense of serenity and elegance. Despite his visceral urge to slit the throat of the defiant vermin, Buzzcock restrained his impulses, wisely choosing diplomacy over violence on this occasion. Glancing quickly at the condescending Shackler and the filthy Melcree, who were gorging themselves on his mood swings like moviegoers with their popcorn packets in front of a good movie, reality mockingly reminded him that nothing good would come of this conflict. Helplessly, he had to let Kyle, Will, and the felines join Jake and his group. Svara arrived a short time later under the protection of Mufasa and Duchess. Buzzcock had not yet said his last word. He still had one more card to play to beat the crap out of this newborn faction. "My slaves, come back to your master," the Nawai leader exclaimed in a regal tone while extending his hand to them, as if he were imbued with divine authority. His inviting hand and gentle, reassuring crooked smile were about as believable as a pedophile offering candy to young children outside the school. And yet, many of the refugees who had recently joined Jake's group responded to this call with helpless faces. Their betrayal inevitably awakened the insecurities of the other survivors, and they began to panic again. Kyle was not at all comfortable with this situation, thinking that the Nawai had just ruined Jake's recruitment efforts while he was away, but he relaxed when he noticed that Jake still wore an indifferent expression. Will, who had not yet been briefed on the origins of all these refugees either, was equally impassive, content to memorize the remaining faces for their future plans. After retrieving the slaves under contracts graciously saved by Jake, Buzzcock chuckled gleefully. The number of refugees following Jake had nearly dwindled by a third, and a good half looked torn by a difficult choice, as if they were about to switch sides any second. Getting the hint, the other two faction leaders also recalled their own slaves. Only then did Jake and the others realize how much influence these three evolvers had in this oracle shelter. "Hee, please come back over here." Melcree giggled melodiously, almost bashfully. Her voice was far more delicate than her appearance suggested. What an honorless piece of livestock. An alien of the same species as Shackler and wearing the same type of ceremonial garb harumphed without hiding any of his contempt. Unlike Melcree, Shackler did not politely ask them to join him. He was far too lofty to stoop to such mediocrity. His apathetic and calculating look, as if he were evaluating common consumables, was enough to make their blood run cold. Without a word, the slaves concerned hastily changed sides. After all these slaves were claimed back by their respective factions, the number of refugees behind Jake was down to a third of his original members. But Buzzcock had no intention of stopping there. He wanted to punish this impertinent human to the fullest. He wanted to make him understand that no outsider was free to act as he wanted on his turf. As you can see, by staying with this human, only death awaits you, the Nawai chief declared wickedly as he revealed his long fangs. "I know you fear me. Many of you even hate me, but you also know how I treat my men. I promise you that. Anyone who serves me loyally during this difficult time will be entitled to a membership in my faction and the same treatment as the veterans under my command from my native tribe. Make your choice. You have 5 minutes. If after that you change your mind, the terms will not be so favorable." Jake held back from applauding after listening to Buzzcock's engaging speech. For an alien who only a few months earlier had been the equivalent of a Decerebrate, lecherous Homo erectus. Such an evolution could be considered praiseworthy. Perhaps because Jake's face was frozen between mockery and admiration or simply out of complacency, but the Nawai chief interpreted this human's constipated countenance as fright and drew deep contentment from it. In the end, you're just another pathetic human. Ignoring everything about the alien's narcissistic delusions, Jake instead observed the other two leaders, studying their reactions and comparing them to what he knew of their character. Taking a cue from Buzzcock, Melcree also tried to poach refugees from him by offering favorable terms, but with limited success. Her faction was already a bit weaker than the other two leaders, and her appearance was, unfortunately, neither charismatic nor charming. On the other hand, her faction was known for its neutral position in this shelter. She could intercede and express her opinions, but as for her ability to fight against tides of digesters, nobody was optimistic. Schachteler, on the other hand, remained true to himself. His fascism and racism made him particularly smug, and he refused to relax his recruitment conditions. With this kind of mentality, it was a miracle that his faction still had so many members, but it was mainly thanks to a few qualified subordinates that he had reached this point. If he had relied on himself, it would have been an accomplishment if he could make his own food. And despite this spoiled brat temperament, this alien was still one of the 3 most powerful evolvers in the shelter. To be able to do that, he must have had some undeniable qualities, and from what Will and Svara had told him, it all boiled down to 2 words: power and intelligence. Although the Roganians were rather large, in terms of raw strength, Schachteler was not that dangerous, and second ordeal evolvers specialized in physical strength and hand-to-hand combat could best him. However, to get there, they would have to get past his close guard and protective magics. With his excellent mastery of water and ice magic, this mage was a walking fortress. He usually didn't need to move an inch to defeat his opponents, and was a perfect counter to Buzzcock's brutal and straightforward style. Eventually, by the time Buzzcock and Melcree were done with their second round of recruiting, there were only 600 refugees left in Jake's group. Most of them were humans or aliens rescued by Jake, whose slave contracts had been transferred to him. For the few others, they either hated the faction leaders or were deeply attached to their freedom. Among these loyal refugees, the prostitute and the old man were still present. Jake also recognized the group of individuals he had seen being harassed by Grosh. The balding man, the young woman, and the boy had obviously not managed to leave the shelter in time either. Grateful for his help, they had chosen once again to place their hopes in him. In the midst of these refugees, there was also a frail human actively trying to make himself smaller. Grash had already spotted him and been pointing him out to Jake for a while now, identifying this individual as the exceptional hustler who had shamelessly sold that cleaning alcohol to this alien powerhouse. For the moment, Jake had no intention of acquainting himself with this weirdo, but in the face of this human's crystal-clear, piercing gaze, the hustler felt as if all his secrets had been laid bare. Moreover, although their appearances were exotic, he knew how to recognize fellow Earthlings when he came across them. Right now, he was extremely tense, fearing that Jake would explain to Grash the real value of this vintage stuff. That's it. These words from Jake brought the trickster out of his inner monologue. At that moment, Jake was shooting a scornful and contemptuous look at Buzzcock and the other 2 leaders. His scruffy group may have been at a severe numerical disadvantage, but he was not afraid. Grash, Mufasa, and Shere Khan were at his side, and worse comes to worse, he had his purgatory to escape. Noticing that the human was still as arrogant as ever, Buzzcock retracted his smiling facade to display a cold face. "You really don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" he snorted. "Keep pretending to be better than you are. Reality will catch up with you soon enough. In a little while, if the digesters haven't eaten you, you'll wish you were dead." Turning to his men, he raised his fist in the air and barked, "We're leaving." Schachteler and Melcree's armies also began to move after this signal. Keeping a good distance between them, all 3 factions headed in the same direction, toward the entrance of the Black Cube. Their plan was to leave the shelter. This was different from the discussion he had hoped for, but Jake had no intention of staying behind. He needed these faction leaders in the know to show him the way and cover his back, or at least his front. Now he just had to hope that it would be enough. Taking one last look at the dimmed yellow cube, Jake and his group sighed and set off as well. Chapter 5, 31 New Members. So, Grash, what's waiting for us outside? It's time for you to tell us what you know about this dungeon digester. Jake inquired grimly after leaving the reassuring walls of the black cube behind them. After leaving the Oracle shelter, the four factions had found themselves in a barren forest covered with ash and ferns of the same dull gray. As an outsider, Jake could have seen it as just another alien ecosystem, but from the locals' anxious faces, it was definitely not normal. Their only consolation was that they hadn't been attacked yet. The digesters that had raided the Oracle playground and infested their shelter were nowhere in sight when they should have been rampant in their own territory. From what Will had gleaned while chatting, there was still a lush forest a few days ago. Oxygen levels had also seriously dropped, making physical exercise difficult for normal humans and aliens. Some were already experiencing dizziness and hallucinations after walking a few hundred meters outside the black cube. Without the protection and camouflage of the Oracle shelter, the collective mood had become unnaturally gloomy and a heavy silence had set in, with only the gasping wheezing of the refugees to be heard. For some of these civilians, this was the first time they had left the shelter since taking refuge there. If circumstances permitted, they would never have taken such a risk. Goddamn Oracle system. Grash ranted audibly after spouting a string of unintelligible syllables. It had been a long time since Jake had witnessed the Oracle's almighty censorship. Don't tell me it's because I didn't finish my fourth ordeal yet. Jake wondered. I'm afraid so. Grash chuckled awkwardly. Hurry up and finish your fourth ordeal so we can talk normally. Jake's lip twitched slightly as he heard the alien complain. Given their current situation, there was something totally absurd about the Oracle system's censorship. Can't the Oracle make an exception when these kinds of exceptional incidents occur? It had been a while since his AI had spoken, but she replied in a jaded tone. I'm afraid not. As long as your life is not in immediate danger, I doubt the Oracle will agree to change its protocols. And since the Oracle is blind here and is being interfered with, it is obviously unable to correctly predict what is in store for us. Grumbling in frustration, Jake looked back to Grash and suggested, At least tell me where you think they are headed? Why do these three leaders seem to know exactly where they are going? I don't get the impression they're looking for the exit. Will and Svara's eyes gleamed with curiosity as they heard his question. They were wondering exactly the same thing. They might not be looking for a way out. The giant pig-like humanoid conceded half-heartedly. Jake's face scrunched up hearing that. If they aren't looking for a way out, why are we following them? He was rightly incensed. Grash turned livid as he thought about the real reason behind their behavior. Because sometimes it's less dangerous to walk into the wolf's mouth than to run away from it. He replied evasively. Jake didn't insist any further with his questions. He understood that this was the limit of what Grash was allowed to tell them. Calling to Will, he ordered, I want the map of the Oracle shelters and cubes nearby where we are. It's as good as done. I figured you'd ask me that. The businessman smiled as he transferred a file to him through his wristband. Inspecting the relatively complete map of the surrounding area, Jake became thoughtful as he studied the layout of the shelters. He knew even before his first ordeal that no matter where he was located on B842, there would always be an Oracle shelter or a red cube within 200 kilometers. Today he knew that they were usually arranged in a square, with an Oracle shelter at each corner and a red cube in the wilderness placed right in the center of that square. This pattern repeated itself identically on the entire surface of the planet, including in the so-called non-living areas. The information that was new to him was that 9 of these squares made up of 4 shelters and a wild red cube formed together a larger square called region, in the center of which stood the famous Oracle cities of the Oracle Playground, which they accessed using orange cubes. The Oracle Playground's secure territory was also camouflaged by a huge black cube. But unlike the Oracle shelters established on the ground, this black cube orbited in space a few hundred kilometers above. The security measures were also much more advanced, making these places of leisure almost impregnable fortresses. If the digesters had not used the infiltrated shelter's orange cubes to reach the Oracle Playground's dimension, it would never have fallen under digester control. There was no doubt that those responsible would be heavily punished once this fiasco was resolved. In short, escaping from here was theoretically not difficult if they knew where the digester's territory ended. Dungeon digester or not, its size and number of subordinates had to be limited. Assuming that the digesters behind this invasion came from the inhospitable area to the west, it made sense to flee to the east. This was not the direction Buzzcock and the other faction leaders were heading in. Dejected, Jake decided to trust Grash and those other Fourth Ordeal players on this one. Help! Please, she needs help. Shouts of distress brought him back to the present moment. Glancing in the direction of the noise, he saw an ugly alien resembling some kind of strange goblin supporting a similar alien of smaller stature, possibly his wife. Refugees of all races had long since learned to gibber in Oriclean to make themselves understandable, but as weak civilians they did not have the stats of other evolvers. Their intelligence varied greatly from species to species, and not all of these aliens had a natural talent for languages. In this case, this goblin had a choppy accent that made his gibberish almost incomprehensible. Crouching down without a word next to the passed-out female alien, Jake scanned her with his mental sense and impassively diagnosed exhaustion, malnutrition, and severe hypoxia. She needs rest. If we stop, we'll get left behind by the other factions. Kyle shook his head as he saw that several other refugees were also about to collapse. Should we give them a chance? Will offered nonchalantly with a slanted look of heavy meaning. We don't really have a choice. Jake sighed. It's either that or losing half the refugees within the next hour. I wonder how the other factions are planning to handle this. Very well. So be it. Will nodded placidly. The next second, all the refugees received a notification in their bracelets, or rather an invitation. You have been invited by Vice Leader Will Hopkins to join the Murtharian Nerds faction. Do you accept? Yes or no? Aside from the ridiculous faction name, the refugees didn't have much time to ponder the pros and cons. Their situation was critical, and for outcasts like them to join a faction was more than they could possibly hope for. The old man and the hustler accepted the invitation without blinking an eye, followed immediately by the red-headed prostitute and the balding man's group. After validating their choice, their bodies suddenly seized up, their eyes almost popping out of their heads. Their reaction momentarily scared the other refugees who had not yet validated their choice, but they yelled in excitement and shock at what happened next. The old man's wheezing and cyanotic complexion disappeared almost instantly. Straightening up, the old man walked a few steps, then to everyone's surprise threw a few jabs and kicks that made the air hum before muttering with emotion. My limp is gone. It's like I'm 20 again. No, I'm even stronger. The prostitute and the balding man experienced the benefits of a similar remodeling. How magical, the red-headed former lawyer marveled before urging her two sons to accept the invitation. Come on, hurry. Seeing that joining this faction had only advantages, the refugees abandoned their reluctance and happily accepted. The goblin husband took it upon himself to accept the invitation for his fainted wife, who woke up a few seconds later. Watching with amusement as the refugees were ecstatic about their new physical abilities and the specifics of their faction skills, Jake couldn't help but bust up the mood. A gift like this comes with a lot of responsibility. He stated sternly, if your life wasn't in danger the moment you left the shelter, I would never have allowed such a concession. I would have let you prove yourself by watching you for a long time before making my decision. Most of you might have died, but I have neither the time nor the inclination to help ungrateful people who will not hesitate to betray me as soon as the wind changes. Some of you are just that kind of people. Maybe you are spies for the other factions or slaves left here against your will to monitor us. It doesn't matter. If you betray my trust, you die. If you disobey my orders, you will be kicked out immediately with no chance of pardon. Think carefully about your actions from now on. It's not every day in life that you get a second chance. Chapter 532 Promising Recruits. This short, ultimatum-like speech profoundly affected the refugees who had just joined his faction, perhaps more so than his previous warnings. Many of these civilians were no strangers to his words. They thought they had time to change, to enjoy the comfortable cocoon that was the Oracle shelter before eventually emerging from their chrysalis and spreading their butterfly wings. Regrettably, recent events had nipped this hope in the bud. With the increase in ether density and the corresponding rise in the digester's average level, they had missed the boat. Even though their ether stats were approaching 60 points by closely following the ether density growth curve, It was of no practical benefit to them, since everything from grass to microbes were upgraded accordingly. Digesters were no exception. The rank 1 digesters that Jake and the other evolvers had slaughtered by the thousands in the Oracle Playground were different from those on their first day on B842. This energy level was enough to allow them to quickly advance to rank 3 or 4. All they needed was enough genetic and etheric material to perfect their mutation. Sometimes devouring a single prey was enough to give them the inspiration and nutrients they needed to make that leap. Ether density also had the advantage and disadvantage of stabilizing the protozoal of humans and other aliens. Where Jake had struggled greatly to strengthen his spirit body and awaken his extrasensory perception, this kind of awakening was becoming common even in civilians who had never held a weapon. This was an inconvenience because digesters also benefited from this phenomenon. As creatures spawned by ether, they had a greater ability than humans to harness and use ether, and their souls were stable from birth. As a direct result, the proportion of digesters with special abilities was also severely increased. These rank 1 and 2 digesters they had slaughtered may have possessed a standard body type, but many of them had freakish powers they didn't have before, ranging from increased stamina, speed, and strength bursts to more esoteric abilities such as becoming untraceable or breathing fire or lightning. But most importantly, their murderous intent generated a tangible, evil psychic force that was incredibly difficult for the refugees to nullify. For Jake and those other experienced evolvers, they probably wouldn't notice it even if they were basking in it. But for those fearful civilians, it was definitely enough to make them shiver with terror and shit their pants. In conclusion, any clear-headed refugee knew that Jake's words were not empty threats. If they refused to fight, even if they managed to survive, the only fate awaiting them would be to be at the mercy of another master or to rot in another shelter until they died. "I will fight," the old man swore solemnly as he placed his right fist over his heart. "The Oracle system cured my cancer, but not my long-scarred and injured knee. When I first came here, I was shot in the head in a skirmish and was in a coma for over a month. When I woke up, I owed a lot of people ether and had already missed my chance. Now that I have this vigor and a good spear to fight with, I don't intend to waste this gift." That's the spirit. Jake smiled approvingly as he beheld the old man's overflowing enthusiasm. Perhaps because this man was much older than they were, but his grit gave some of the other refugees the boost of bravery they lacked, and they eagerly knelt down to make the same pledge. The young mother prostitute took the same oath. For her children, she was willing to make any sacrifice. Jake memorized these new faces and decided to keep a close eye on them in the coming battles. They may not have known it, but their decisive resolve at that moment had just changed their lives. "What's your name?" he asked for the first time as he looked at these courageous refugees. In addition to the old man and the red-headed woman, there were 2 men in their 20s, another pig-like alien of the same species as Grash, the pair of goblin-like aliens he'd rescued, some sort of humanoid octopus with 6 tentacles for legs and 2 pairs of arms covered with suction cups, and the barely over-age young woman in the balding man's group. On the animal side, a huge orange turkey wearing one of the helmets he had forged and some kind of buffalo with green fur also showed their willingness to fight. These creatures could not yet speak, but it seemed that their intelligence was exceptional compared to their peers. Their ability to survive in this shelter was proof of that. "People call me Ingranus the Bold, my lord," the old man answered first with a bow. "A nobleman or a knight?" We'll cut in with a hint of curiosity. That explains a knight, vice leader. Ingranus clarified politely with another bow. His etiquette was impeccable, as one would expect from a former aristocrat. The other 2 humans introduced themselves just after. Their etiquette was much looser, but their outspokenness was more to Jake's and the others' liking. "Nicolay from EGA, sir." The first man with flashy short yellow hair and an unshaven beard several weeks old said concisely. "Dickon from X or my lord." The second man, a stockier dark-haired man but half a head shorter, took a cue from his friend and introduced himself without fuss. "Another Aegean, huh?" Jake muttered out loud as he thought of the 2 sisters waiting for them at the base. If he knew that their father had tried to meet him to give him a beating, he certainly wouldn't have been so relaxed thinking about the 2 young women. The pig-like alien of the same species as Grash had an equally inspired name and went by the sobriquet of Brash. He also learned for the first time that Grash and his brethren were indeed humanoid, but were not considered to be of the human type as were Earthlings, Aegeans, or Naways, but a type of Orcish species. The goblin couple was called Zort and Nis. Their specific species had an incomprehensible name, but they belonged to the larger class of goblins as he had surmised from their hideous appearance. With their height of about a meter, their greenish skin, their pointed ears, and their primitive attire, it was hard to mistake them for anything else. The octopus alien spoke a language that was incomprehensible to humans, but with the help of a translator, Jake was able to figure out that it came from a water-covered planet. He couldn't help but wonder how he ended up here. According to its words, it had been fished out by another group of aliens just before their world was transferred here. Your name is impossible to pronounce. To facilitate our exchanges, you will answer to the name of Takoyaki from now on. Jake decided arbitrarily. The octopus alien would eventually regret the name, but unaware of its true meaning, he gratefully accepted his new moniker. The red-headed prostitute was called CC1, a strange name for an Earthling, and it made him realize that she was not from Earth, but simply from a world with similar morals. Finally, the young woman barely of age with a rebellious look and medium-length black hair was called Kelly, a pure Terran of Canadian origin. Disgusted with the cowardice of her original group, she had chosen to stand out to protect the young boy accompanying her, who, if he wasn't her brother, was an orphan like her that she had taken under her wing. After this series of introductions, Jake waited another minute to see if any of the other refugees wanted to muster up their courage, but the silence and shifty looks told him it was time to get back on the road. The human trickster in whom he had such high hopes seemed to have a rather cowardly character. Whatever. If he wanted to survive, he would have to fight. Despite all these solemn promises, it was in a life-and-death situation that they would know if these refugees were worth it. Now that their bodies had been strengthened by the Murtharian body passive, Jake was able to pick up the pace, and it wasn't long before they caught up to the other factions. They didn't encounter any digesters for the next few hours, but they had left the shelter quite late. The sun had begun its descent, and it would soon be dark. Shouldn't we stop and set up camp? Will suggested with a bad pang. Jake hesitated for a moment, but shook his head in the end. That would be a wise move, but if the other factions refuse to stop, I don't think we can take that risk. If we get ambushed by a large horde, our chances of survival will be better if we stay together. Dismayed, the businessman sighed but did not object. He knew Jake was right. An hour later, night fell completely. Because of the thick cloud cover, neither moonlight nor starlight could reach them, and the darkness was overwhelming. If Jake and the other evolvers didn't have ether vision or similar abilities, they would have had a hard time finding their way in the dark. Sadly, the other refugees could not say the same, and they trembled in terror as they gripped their new weapons tightly. Suddenly, someone broke into a cheer among the refugees. They're setting up camp. Indeed, Jake spotted a campfire a few kilometers ahead of them. The three factions had finally settled down for the night. They could finally get some rest. Or so they thought. Chapter 533, There is Still Hope. Is it wise to light a campfire with this darkness? Kyle snickered without addressing anyone. Svara and Will pursed their lips at his comment. This campfire was a blazing inferno, and it was hard to get it any more flashy in this pitch-black ash forest. With no moon or stars in the sky, those flames would alert every digester within a dozen kilometers. It's pretty chilly out there, CC1 muttered as she exhaled the warm air in her lungs that everyone could see. Checking his bracelet, Jake frowned as he confirmed the temperature. It had indeed dropped below freezing. Considering the large portion of raggedly clad refugees in the three factions, the campfire was practically a necessity to get through the night. Because their bodies were slowly being strengthened by the Murtharian body passive, his group was virtually unaffected by these climatic variations. I hope we don't get attacked because of them. Wilt sked to the side as he began to set up his tent with his dragon and the feline's help. I hope so too, but still, even if we do, they will be the ones attacked first. Svara quipped with a devilish grin on her face. She almost seemed to welcome such a script. If you have time to chit-chat, use it to set up camp and get something to eat. Until proven otherwise, digesters have excellent hearing. Jake cut their chatter short with a glare. Seeing him raise his voice, the refugees who had been chatting about this and that while resting their legs fell silent and got down to business. No one was spared, and everyone contributed to the group effort, including Will, Kyle, and Svara. The only ones who were exempt from this treatment were Jake, Grash, Mufasa, and Shere Khan, who stood guard with the utmost vigilance. On the lion's advice, the other felines were also dispatched to patrol around their makeshift camp. The felines were tough beasts with much sharper senses than most humans. Even if the digesters did eventually attack, they would not be taken by surprise. With the camp set up, they ate their rations in silence, straining their ears for any sign of enemy movement. The only source of light was the three factions' campfire a few miles away, and because of that the mere rustle of a branch in the wind was enough to stir their imaginations. Even without Jake's wake-up call, they were determined to keep their mouths shut until morning. As the more frail and exhausted of the bunch gradually dozed off, Jake's eyes widened when he heard gunshots in the distance. Hearing footsteps near him, he discovered that Kyle, Svara, and the other felines resting in the camp were also on edge. In the end, they still attacked. Kyle grumbled as he stroked the blade of his sword with a mixture of impatience and unrest. He wasn't afraid to fight, but he still didn't enjoy facing a number of unknown enemies in the dead of night. We were prepared for this, Jake said apathetically. Wake up the other refugees quietly and tell them to prepare for battle. Kyle and Svara nodded, while the felines present climbed the nearest trees to gain visibility and prepare an ambush. Will was startled awake by the breath of his baby dragon and could not help but call names at the digesters for ruining his sleep. The other refugees were then awakened one by one and soon began to panic. The fateful battle that would decide whether or not they would see the sun rise again was going to take place in the next few minutes. Soaring like a ghost above the ground, Jake silently flew up before launching a maximum range scan. His pupils shining like stars, his sight pierced the darkness to peer at the fight raging in the campsite a few kilometers up ahead. The campfire had long since been extinguished, leaving only a few smoldering embers as evidence of its existence. The cries of terror, rage, and anguish were audible despite the distance, as were the gunshots. Every now and then an explosion or a flashy spell would push back the darkness and startle them, but it was mostly the omnipresent shrill cackling that gradually consumed the will and composure of the combatants. Although the three factions' camp was several kilometers away from theirs, for the digesters it was an insignificant distance that they could bridge in no time. The cacophony of shrill cackling that fed the nightmares of every evolver and refugee grew in volume rapidly, reminding them mercilessly that enemies were marching toward them too. Bloody hell, we've been spotted. Kyle cursed as he saw thousands of ether signatures appear out of nowhere before his ether vision. Meow, meow, roar. The felines patrolling outside the camp meowed, roared, or snarled depending on their natural language to sound the alarm. Soon after, their warning meows and roars changed to growls and small earthquakes, as the trees at their position were uprooted one after another by the violence of the clashes. Jake, who had already received most of the information from his scan, turned gloomy as he received the echo of the clashes from the patrolling felines. They were ambushed from all sides. This was definitely no accident. The digesters had spotted them long ago and had prepared for this all-out assault. Battle positions. Jake bellowed loudly. He hesitated for a second to activate his purgatory, but decided against it. With the digesters' obsessive appetite for ether sources, he had no desire to goad them. He had no intention of becoming these monsters' priority target after flaunting his newfound wealth for a short while. An easy victory was not worth this price. After all, they were far from being out of the woods, and there would surely be many battles like this in the hours and days to come. The refugees didn't know that he had these tricks up his sleeve, so they had little time to hold a grudge against him. They were far too busy thinking about how to survive the next 5 minutes. Kikikikek. They're here. Everyone drew a cold breath as they heard this unnerving noise bursting out of the bushes all around them. At the same time, a huge ball of compressed flame struck the area from which the beastly cackling originated and triggered a deafening explosion, vaporizing a dozen trees in the process. A shower of silvery blood and grayish guts scattered in all directions, painting over the leaves and branches of nearby trees. The cackling stopped dead in its tracks. Before the refugees could make sense of this calamitous technique, a salvo of fireballs began to fall from the sky like a meteor shower, offering a show that would have been wonderful for the eyes in any other circumstances. These tens, hundreds of incandescent projectiles like shooting stars bombarded the area, leveling the ground by several meters and raising the temperature of the mercury at a lightning speed. The earth, forest, and bombed-out monsters liquefied, emitting intense heat and light as the trapped digesters shrieked in agony. For these refugees who had never held a weapon before, they should have been terrorized by this apocalyptic scene, but instead they were seized with amazement as they realized that the blast of heat that should have made them sweat like crazy had instead given them a surge of vitality. In shock, they momentarily forgot their predicament. Of course, the one who had produced the fireballs was Jake, who was still floating above them like a living god. As long as he lived, these refugees would not break down completely. This bombardment had another merit, and that was to provide a decent source of light for the group. Those digesters from whom they could only see the etheric signatures were now visible, and most had suffered heavy injuries after this aerial bombing. However, this was only a brief interlude in the onset of a battle that was just beginning. A second wave of monsters flooded out of the undamaged stretch of forest, stepping over the corpses of their kin to fight their way through the flames. At the cost of some burns and sacrifices, the first flock managed to reach the camp. Figuring it was his turn to show off, Mufasa shuffled regally before the horde and let out an otherworldly roar. This ferocious howl shook the earth, producing a supersonic blast with a huge spiritual charge that swept everything in its path. When the roar ended, a cone-shaped trench 100 meters long and several meters deep had split the earth in two. The digesters at this location were nowhere in sight. Shere Khan, not to be outdone, stomped the ground with his front paw, and his fur began to vibrate, generating an overwhelming electric current. The air crackled as blinding purple lightning enveloped his massive body in a bright light. Then, Shere Khan also roared, and the lightning was discharged with a clap of thunder. All the digesters within range of his mental sense were struck dead on the spot. After only one big move from Jake, Mufasa, and Shere Khan, the digester horde had already suffered a severe setback. In the face of their leader's mighty display, for the first time these refugees began to dream of victory. There was still hope. Chapter 534. Where is he? Not for long, though. No sooner had they rejoiced than the cackling broke out again, this time with a venomous inflection. In the midst of the river of flames spurred on by Jake's unrestrained bombardment, some unreasonably tough digesters were even scrambling to get up with heartbreaking yelps of pain. Jake frowned as he witnessed these monsters recover from his downpour of ionized gas spheres. Their hideous bodies were blistered, their skin and muscles had melted, revealing bones with a silvery sheen underneath, but they were very much alive. Squinting his eyes, he saw that these creatures, or at least what was left of them, were convulsing as if they were having an epileptic fit. The flames that were licking at their bodies and charring them at a slow rate scorched what was left of their bodies, but instead of reducing them to ashes, a portion of their energy was sucked into their cells. Their veins began to glow in a familiar way, and Jake recognized this as the manifestation of an ether skill similar to that of his Murtharian bloodline. Holy shit, they're mutating. Within seconds, he saw the few lucky survivors of this spectacular plasma shower rise to their feet in a bipedal position, their limbs regenerating at a speed visible to the naked eye. Their silvery forearms were constantly changing shape, a slightly translucent batracian skin allowing a glimpse of their incandescent vein network, as well as robust legs capable of reversing the direction of their joints at will. The single baseball-sized eye on top of their tiny head regenerated before glowing red ominously. A huge lower jaw with long, thin, sharp teeth separated from the rest of the skull, making it look as if the monster's tiny head had been rent in half by its own weight. Given the speed at which the tips of their limbs changed shape and their sudden growth spurt to 3 meters in height, Jake immediately identified them as newborn fire spitters. These rank 1 and 2 digesters had evolved into rank 3 variants in less than a minute. Having just gotten a first-class look at the mutation potential of these monsters, Jake gasped and solemnly reminded himself not to underestimate these creatures, no matter how weak they might be for now. With the current ether density, Rank 1 or 4 made almost no difference. They dropped about the same amount of ether. However, it would be a mistake to lump them together. Jake and the felines could certainly handle either one, but the refugees could not. They had a fair chance of winning against a rank 1 digester one-on-one with a good melee weapon or firearm, but they would die 10 times out of 10 fights against a rank 4 digester if they didn't have at least some heavy artillery. Fortunately, these fire spitters were only rank 3. They were not completely invulnerable to heat. Despite their mind-numbing mutation, the flames got the upper hand, and when their evolution came to an end, only 3 of them were still alive, but they had only a breath left in them. Still, that didn't stop those 3 fire spitters from fighting back with shrill, hateful shrieks. In front of the dumbstruck boom. Their hearts skipped a beat as the fireballs hit him and generated an impressive fireworks display. But the next moment they turned slack-jawed as they beheld the flames being rapidly sucked into a siphon that was none other than their leader's mouth. When Jake reappeared, the flames had vanished and he let out a small burp of satisfaction. He was completely unharmed. "You don't know when to quit, don't you?" he snarled as he slashed the air with his empty hand. Almost simultaneously, the 3 fire spitters' heads were bisected in half. Their blobbering eyes burst into a stream of silver blood as the red glow inside died out with regret. The refugees cheered, but it was then that the rest of the horde came upon them. Brandishing their new weapons, they let out frantic cries to build up their courage, but Jake could still see a few of them retreating stealthily, as if they could escape the battle by feigning participation. Exasperated, he ignored those guys and focused on those who held their ground. Some of them had already peed themselves and were shivering like they'd been thrown naked into a blizzard, but at least they weren't running away. "Very good. We can still do something about you guys," Jake muttered indistinctly. Speaking telepathically to his companions, felines included, he commanded, "Eliminate rank 2, 3, and 4 digesters first. Let a few rank 1 digesters through so these refugees can get their hands on them." "Copy that." "Understood." Svara unleashed her 4 shadow wolves and picked out a strong digester for each one. She herself drew her sword and darted forward to a rank 3 digester. With a graceful and masterful dance, she whirled among the monsters, slicing through sinew and muscle until she reached her target. Feeling a gust of wind ruffle her hair, the female warrior ducked almost parallel to the ground at the last moment to dodge a deadly blow and bounce back just before smashing her face, diving between the creature's legs and rolling behind it, not forgetting to slice its hocks. The 9 feet tall humanoid digester fell to his knees, and with a lightning backhanded sword slashed his head. As for the monsters she had crippled by severing their tendons, they became perfect training targets for the courage-seeking refugees. Needless to say, it was much easier to find it when the monster in front of them could no longer move. These wounded digesters were ripped apart in no time, and because these refugees had never held a weapon, they suffered more than they needed to, sustaining multiple non-lethal but painful wounds before succumbing. Meow? Turning his head, Jake saw a black fur ball resembling a huge sea urchin bouncing around like an inflatable ball in the distance. Zooming in on the ball of fur, he vaguely recognized the features of his cat Crunch, but his demeanor was quite different at that moment. Curled up in a ball, its fur was bristling like a porcupine's and its hair had grown to several meters long. Hard and sharp like long rods of tempered steel, he had literally become a several-ton steel ball covered in spikes. Its long tail had also changed shape, extending and retracting in a spiral like a long spring that it used to catapult itself. Once launched, Crunch was unstoppable, and Jake could see trees and digesters alike in the distance being knocked down like pins by a bowling ball. Next to him, his partner Thomas O'Malley, the cheetah, was just like a lightning bolt, so fast that his outline was almost impossible to follow even for him. After his silent passage, there would remain nothing but a supersonic boom and corpses without heads or with their throats slit. The other felines were not outdone. Duchess, the female leopard Crunch had a crush on, was less expansive and preferred to ambush her targets soundlessly. She didn't kill much compared to Crunch and his buddy, but the method was particularly chilling. Dropping down from a branch like a ghost, the strongest digesters targeted would die almost instantly, stripped of their life force. The most shocking thing about this was that the other monsters in the area had never noticed that one of their own had just fallen. By the time they reacted, Duchess was long gone in search of other prey. Bagheera, the Black Panther, shared the same style, and Jake had time to catch a glimpse this time of how the feline killed his targets. He simply grazed them lightly with one of his claws, causing an unquenchable bleed that his victims were unaware of. It was painless and instantaneous. The blood loss was nothing to speak about, but death would ensue almost immediately afterwards, long before these digesters were depleted of their blood. Remembering Mufasa's Nurgle's claws and fangs, which had a bleeding, corrosion, and life drain effect, he got an inkling of how these felines were able to become such efficient hunters. Spying on the other cats, he discovered that with the exception of Crunch, who was an anomaly with his eccentric style, they hunted their prey pretty much in the same way. Unfortunately, he also noticed that some of them had a bad habit of playing with their food for an unnecessarily long time. When he saw that the lynx Toulouse and the Siamese cat Berlioz were still bleeding alive the same monster for a good 2 minutes already, he yelled, "Stop playing and get to work." Noticing Jake's displeasure, Mufasa roared at his two subordinates, and they meowed resentfully before turning back into efficient killing machines. The 4 probationary cats were under the supervision of the 4 lionesses Nala, Kiera, Sarabi, and Zira. While protecting them, they taught them the art of hunting by letting them practice and finish off wounded digesters. As such, the 4 lionesses were also excellent tutors for the refugees. Quite a few of them benefited from their leniency and scored a few kills. The ether they gained allowed them to improve their ether stats for the first time in their lives, and this surge of power gave them the addictive rush of adrenaline and dopamine that Jake and the other evolvers were so fond of. Calmly overseeing the battle, Jake finally relaxed when he saw that it was going smoothly. He was not twiddling his thumbs, and using his extreme dexterity and perception, he would headshot any strong digesters with an air bullet before they reached the edge of their base. Mufasa and Shere Khan did the same, killing the most dangerous monsters and maiming those too weak to warrant dirtying their claws. Bang! Just as Jake was beginning to think they were going to make it through without any casualties, the first scream of agony sounded in the camp below him. Looking down, he saw a crater 6 meters in diameter right beneath him, in the center of which stood a weird monster with some impressive murderous aura. Then he noticed another thing. Cal was nowhere in sight. Chapter 535, Rank 9 Digester. For fuck's sake, where did that fucking idiot go? Jake cursed as he scanned the forest with his mental sense. It didn't take a genius to figure out where this sister Khan had gone. Realizing the magnitude of the assault they were under, he could only imagine with trepidation what the 3 factions were facing. It should not be forgotten that unlike them, they had been so bold as to light a blazing campfire to signal their position to the enemy. Without a doubt, Cal had not been able to contain his anxiety. His paranoia had certainly made him forget all common sense, and he had deserted his post to run over like the dependable big brother that he was. The problem was that in addition to being unreliable, he was also far from invincible. Jake wanted to charge toward the 3 factions' camp to stop his comrade in his tracks, but a demonic howl deeper than he was prepared for blared from below him. The perpetrator of this sound had an incredible resonance chamber, and even he felt his organs vibrate and his teeth rattle as the lengthy sound wave passed through him. If he was in this state, there was no need to even imagine what the other refugees were going through. Most were bleeding from their noses, eardrums, or eyes, while those closest to it had lost consciousness. Will and his dragon, who were closest to the crater, were the hardest hit, and Jake was lucky enough to see his eyes roll back, revealing the white in them before his dragon pet carried him away on his back. Momentarily forgetting about Kyle's defection, Jake was forced to focus on this new foe. The creature was humanoid with a short tail, and not all that massive. About 10 feet tall, its limbs were long and slender, with long arms that fell to its knees. It didn't have intimidating size or other sharp blades at the end of its limbs like the other digesters. Instead, it had nothing. His hands and feet had no fingers or toes, as if the expected separation had never happened. The only noticeable point was that his hands and feet were rather large, thin, and wide like a pair of palms or a fan. From this simple observation, one could already assume that this monster was a good swimmer. But if that was the only thing that distinguished this digester, Jake would never have needed to treat this enemy so seriously. Because it wasn't just his limbs that were lacking in finish. His face wasn't finished either, nor was the rest of his body. Having no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no ears, its face like the rest of the body was like a blank canvas on which one would have poured a pot of paint mixing several shades of blue. Staring at this creature was like observing a nebula, the ocean's depth or the vastness of the twilight sky. Its body was real, but seemed intangible, or rather covered with a kind of opaque liquid. Strange sparks and residual lights sometimes flashed on the surface of his body, as one might expect from a rumbling thunderstorm. Despite its strange morphology, it felt weak, but Jake knew all too well that this monster could not be underestimated or he would pay for it dearly. The ether signature lurking inside this digester was ghastly and turbid, but the sheer amount of power that oozed from it left no doubt as to the monster's might. A rank 9 digester. Everyone gasped in terror as Grash spat it out, gritting his teeth in nervousness as if he were in front of his nemesis. Mufasa and Shere Khan were also snarling in defensive stance. The two huge felines were on the prowl, their posture slumped to the ground, gathering strength to leap explosively at the enemy. Jake had never seen the two felines react so cautiously. Seeing the attitude of his three companions, his heart sank and he too began to take the hint of their plight. If he didn't manage the next step properly, they might be wiped out by this monster. "What should we do?" he asked telepathically, trying not to alert the enemy. His breathing became labored as the digester looked up at him, as if responding to his spirit body's fluctuations, but after that it went back to being static as if it didn't know what to do. Grash gnashed his teeth in frustration, gauging the demonic creature staring at them with detachment. He was sweating profusely, proof of the intense anguish he was dealing with. Evolvers with weaker wills would have shat themselves if they knew what he knew. "Even if we could kill this thing, it's not worth it." The pig-like orc sighed as he accepted his fate. "What do you mean?" Will retorted with confusion. "A rank 9 digester is indeed too much for me, but I reckon it should be fine for you, Mufasa and Shere Khan. Jake is with us too." "You're too optimistic." Jake grimaced after scanning the monster with his bracelet. The average ether stats of this digester is around 30,000. If this creature were a huge behemoth, we might have a chance with our speed and other means by forcing a long attrition battle, but it is a small one. Whether this monster is balanced or specialized in strength, agility, endurance, or intelligence, it will be an almost impossible opponent to outperform. Digester bodies also evolve with each promotion in rank. It's not just their ether stats that grow. This rank 9 digester is a weird one. His humanoid appearance is not that scary, but his spirit power is extraordinary. The weirdest thing is that this digester is not aggressive. This is the first time I've seen this since Nilreg. Will gulped when he heard this. He was not a fool. He understood his insinuations. Even with incredible ether strength, a behemoth weighing thousands of tons would still be slow as fuck, but if that same enemy weighed the same as them, that was another story. It was better for them to fight a titanic rank 10 digester than a human-sized rank 9 like this one. As they watched their leaders panic, the composure of the other refugees nearby began to wane as well. For the moment, the rank 9 digester was bathing in the blood of the unfortunate people it had trampled into its crater, but that blood was quickly receding as if it were being sucked up by something. As it resorbed, one of the victims' faces was exposed for all to see, and a young woman let out a heart-rending scream as she recognized who it belonged to. That face, frozen in an expression of disbelief, was that of the balding man who was too cowardly to fight, but was loving and protective towards his companions. The one who had just shouted was Kelly, the young woman barely of age who had left her former group because she was tired of their cowardice. At this moment, she was sitting on her buttocks at the edge of the crater, having escaped a fatal death. The crushed arm of the balding guy was stuck in a certain posture, palm outstretched, as if he had pushed someone out before he died. The scene was not difficult to reconstruct. At the cost of his life, he had saved the young woman and the little boy in her arms. While he had been a wimp all his life, he had found his courage when he needed it most. Human nature was fascinating. People could be cowardly, lazy, selfish, and even cruel to the point of doubting their own worth as human beings, but all it took was for him to have his back against the wall for that to change. In some ways, Jake was no different from this man. On Earth, He was at best average if judged by the standards of a society that valued effort and discipline. If you had to bet on him before his first ordeal, no one in their right mind would have bet on him. And yet here he was, alive and kicking, outperforming most of his peers, most of whom were long dead. "I'm going to kill you," Kelly wailed, brandishing the saber Jake had made for her. With tears streaming down her face, she charged at the invincible foe, summoning and channeling all her rage into that single thrust. Jake, Will, and Grash froze in fear of the impending disaster. Don't. Too late. No matter how hard Jake tried to stop her with his telekinesis, he was shocked when he realized that his powers had no hold around the rank 9 digester. The psychic waves in his spirit body were like a Faraday cage dispelling any magic inside. It was its own domain. Jake expected to see the young woman die pitifully, but he was taken aback when the monster showed no reaction, letting the blade sink into its heart. As its chest was stabbed, the liquid, cloudy surface of its body seemed to revive. Suddenly, its deep blue skin flashed with an eerie light, and the blade was engulfed inside its thorax. Transfixed, Kelly understood the absurdity of her action. Backing up hastily, she stumbled on the corpse of the balding man and fell backwards. What kind of abomination are you?" she stammered before blacking out. She fainted. Jake exclaimed inwardly with surprise. She didn't seem like the type to lose her temper like that. Inspecting her carefully, he noticed her deathly pallor and sensed that things weren't that simple. "She's still alive," Grash affirmed, forgetting about telepathy. Gritting his teeth, he sighed and said, "We have no choice. Trust me on this one. If you want to live, hit this monster hard at least once. Don't fake it or you'll regret it." "Why?" Will asked suspiciously. "Because this thing needs us for its dungeon." The large orc snorted hatefully. "More accurately, it needs monsters." Chapter 536 Mufasa and Shere Khan. "I'm sorry to question your words," Svara apologized as she joyfully swatted a rank 3 digester, "but I don't think Kelly is doing well. I doubt we'll get anything good out of repeating her feat." "True." Will nodded in earnest. He was still disoriented by the rank 9 digester sound attack and had only just regained consciousness. The thought of attacking that thing head-on could only give him the creeps. Even now, he was still on his dragon's back, letting it carry him around the battlefield like a sack of potatoes. "Are you sure about this?" Jake confirmed sternly as he stared at Grash intently. So far, this alien hadn't exactly shone with intelligence. Even if he knew more than they did, one would have to be completely brain-dead to take his advice at face value. Grash seemed to guess what Jake and the others thought of him, because he justified himself immediately afterwards. "Sure," he grunted with an ugly face as he felt the prejudiced stares of his new companions upon him. "This thing can't be killed easily, and it's not worth it. Even if we could destroy it, it would serve its purpose, and we would still need to hit it hard with everything we have." "Right." He had a point. Jake considered giving it a try, but the cacophony of shrill cackling around them reminded him that the battle was far from over. The explosive landing of this rank 9 digester had killed several refugees, ruining their morale and disrupting their lines. Because of the dangerousness of this new foe, the camp powerhouses like Jake, Grash, Mufasa, and Shere Khan had momentarily stopped exterminating monsters to focus their attention on this abomination capable of wiping them all off the map in seconds if they were not careful. Even after noticing the stillness and nonchalance of the monster, Jake and the others didn't dare relax, too concerned about the prospect of being caught off guard by an enemy stronger than them. "Grash, if you're confident with your plan, occupy that thing first. Meanwhile, me and the others will take out the rest of the horde." Luckily, the boar orc was not the type to hold grudges, and even less the type to bother with such subtleties. He abhorred complex thoughts, and for Jake at that moment, it was a gift of providence. With a nod, he accepted the order wholeheartedly. Seeing that Grash had agreed to test the enemy, Jake stopped dithering and telepathically shouted, "Attack!" Mufasa and Shere Khan's aura, who had been taking it easy all along despite their cataclysmic strikes that could flatten a soccer field by several feet in seconds, underwent a sudden change upon hearing this command. The refugees who had thought they had seen everything about these two felines screamed in terror as they morphed into killing machines, leaving hundreds of afterimages in their wake. To imagine their destructive force, One only had to visualize an indestructible tank being launched at several thousand kilometers per hour. By leveraging their strong muscles, their ether, and their respective elements, Mufasa and Shere Khan could reach staggering speeds for the untrained eye. With each stride of the giant lion, the earth would crumble to bits, caving in under the impact of his every step. His mane would mysteriously stir in an invisible breeze, a pale green halo adding to the splendor of it. Under the influence of this magic, the heavy and bulky body of the lion disappeared in a thick tornado, and each of his claws and bites triggered powerful tornadoes and hurricanes, as if the feline himself was a living storm in the making. With such physical prowess and the wind's assistance, Mufasa didn't even need to touch his victims to destroy them. Several dozen meters before reaching them, his targets would be ravaged by hundreds of lacerations before scattering into thousands of pieces. Those who were more fortunate would take the impact of a supersonic wind blast, blowing their bodies away until their battered bodies were nothing more than a dot on the horizon. Shere Khan was paradoxically even more terrifying. His movements didn't generate the same AoE damage, but the purple lightning coating him made him even more elusive. His speed was just mind-blowing. Where Mufasa's targets had a chance of survival if they weren't directly targeted, anyone who caught the tiger's attention was destined to die. Jake himself would never have considered dodging his attacks before getting his teleportation spell. To survive, he would have had no choice but to take the attack head-on. But was that even possible? As confident as he was in his abilities, he had never faced an opponent like this before. Nilreg and Wyatt were extremely strong, but their appearance was essentially human. The way they fought was not so unusual, and their weaknesses were basically the same as any humans except for a few differences. Shere Khan was different. The lightning surrounding him was a problematic obstacle against which his body was not immune, but more importantly, he knew how to exploit it to accelerate his reflexes, his speed, and the lethality of his attacks. On top of that, the tiger already had a strong body with impressive body stats. If he had to choose, Jake would much rather fight Mufasa, despite his apparent invincibility, than an opponent like Shere Khan who was literally untouchable. In the end, these two pride leaders were quite complementary with two vastly different but equally dominant fighting styles. With the lion and tiger getting down to business, Jake didn't have to do anything. Firing a few air bubbles here and there, he blasted the brains out of the few digesters that slipped through the cracks and let the refugees, Svara, and the other felines do the rest of the work. There was a time when he would have been motivated by this much ether, but these digesters could barely arouse his greed anymore. Despite all his precautions, Jake couldn't prevent the deaths of several of the refugees. The losses were heartbreaking, but he knew deep down that it was inevitable. He was not a god and could not foresee everything, let alone the coming of an eccentric rank 9 digesters. Kelly had regained consciousness and had resumed the fight by holding the hand of the orphan boy whom she had sworn to take care of. The goblin couple also fought back-to-back under the protection of one of the lionesses, while Ingranus, the old man, proved to be a formidable spearman. In a few minutes of battle, and by clinging to Svara for his first kills, he had obtained his first ether points and had immediately used them to enhance his strength, endurance, and agility. Now he could already hold his own against a rank 2 digester of his level. This was obviously not only due to the rapid rise in his ether stats, but the bonus resulting from the Murtharian body passive. His body stats had a bonus of 240% of their actual value, giving him more than 3 times the strength he should have been capable of achieving. If Jake, Will, and Kyle had held this trump card when they arrived on beat 842, things might have turned out very differently. Back then, to defeat his first rank 2 digester, Jake had to empty an entire magazine of his gun and use a carbon nanofiber katana to win fair and square. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Nicolay and Dickon were cooperating closely, but from their anxious expressions, they weren't as comfortable as they pretended to be. They had been injured several times, and their complexion was pale, but with the help of the octopus alien Takoyaki, they had managed to score a few kills. On her side, Cece1, the red-headed former prostitute, was holding hands with her 2 boys, protecting them as best she could. Perhaps because Will had a strong sense of empathy or some less honest reason, but he had chosen to fight nearby with his dragon. With Charizard ready to char any digesters that were a little too bold, She too had managed to kill a monster or two. She was numb with shock, but every time she saw her children's scared expressions, she was reminded of the reason she was fighting. Clang! A deafening shockwave pounded the eardrums of all the survivors, allies and enemies alike at that very moment. Alarmed by the sound, Jake saw Grash let out a grunt of pain before being catapulted into the sky, his armor good for the garbage. At the same time, he saw that his rusty greatsword had been pulled into the rank 9 digester's stomach. The creature had not moved, but the turbid liquid on the surface of its body now glowed intensely, and a shrill hissing sound escaped, with increasing volume from the creature's pores as its body vibrated eerily, forming many ripples on its surface. This monster may not have been moving and was missing a face, but Jake could sense that this thing was pleased. Grash's full-powered attack had met its standards. "Are you okay, Grash?" Jake asked worriedly as he stopped the alien's soaring with his telekinesis. The orc wiped the blood from his face and shook his head. His complexion was hard to judge with his thick skin and bristles, but Jake could have sworn he was livid. Although the alien tried to hide it, the shaking of his legs and hands did not go unnoticed. Executing this attack had cost him dearly. "I'm fine. Everything is going according to plan. Now that the rest of the horde has been eliminated, it's your turn to attack. I have a feeling that otherwise, these digesters will never leave us alone." Jake didn't comment on the alien's last words, but decided to trust him. After all, Grash had already proven to them that he was willing to do what he said. Making up his mind, he took a deep breath and shouted, "Everyone, strike the digester in the center with everything you've got." Chapter 5:37 AM. Let's go. An awkward silence ensued where Jake found out he wasn't as charismatic as he'd thought. In his mind, he visualized the refugees letting out a loud war cry before charging forward relentlessly like in Lord of the Rings' final battle, but no one moved an inch after he gave his order. "What the hell, dude? We don't want to test the waters just to die for nothing." A vein bulged across his forehead as he bore witness to this mutiny. He didn't need to be a genius to guess what was going through all of their minds. He hadn't forgotten that these refugees were still hopelessly scared just a few hours ago. It was too much to expect them to reform in such a short time. Abandoning courtesy, Jake raged. "If you don't attack now, I'll end your life." For good measure, he drew his sword and charged like a cannonball at the rank 9 digester who was still standing. As he plummeted, a huge jet of white flames was ejected from his feet to propel him forth, while a telekinetic barrier enveloped him to increase his aerodynamics and further accelerate his fall. With this two-lever propulsion, Jake momentarily reached a speed close to that of Shere Khan. But this was only possible because he was hurtling straight down like a missile. When he was about to collide with the rank 9 digester, he slashed down. Just before impact, the blade of his brand new sword became white-hot, generating a blinding flash of light. At that very moment, the rank 9 digester, which had not moved one iota since the very beginning, jolted. With an inhuman twist of its torso, the monster contorted itself just enough to avoid being split in half. TSK. Jake's blade sank into the monster's flesh like butter, slicing down from the left collarbone to the armpit on the same side. With a thud, a monstrous arm crashed to the ground, spilling a stream of silver blood and some other dark, opaque blue substance. Shreery. Jake winced in pain as he took in the monster's howl at close range. His vision temporarily blackened at the edges as a metallic taste filled his mouth and throat. At the same time, the white-hot blade of his new sword evaporated instantly, the material not having survived the impact and temperature stress. Filled with regret, Jake reluctantly discarded the hilt of his useless sword before refocusing on the creature. The truth was, he himself had trouble believing his attack was effective. He hadn't seen how Grash had attacked this monster, but seeing his utter failure, he had already resigned himself to the fact that his attack might not have any effect. Cutting off a limb of this digester was already more than he had hoped for in his wildest dreams. But a mere few seconds later, he understood why the orc had told them it was futile to try to kill this thing. Like Kelly and Grash before him, his face turned livid and he felt his legs go limp with weakness. What's happening to me? A horrible feeling of despair and helplessness suddenly swept over him. He felt so weak right now that he was about to black out. If he hadn't tempered his will during the previous ordeals, he probably would have fainted with hardly any resistance. Through his Murtharian eyes, he could see how a myriad of points of light were leaving his body to merge with the digester's ether signature in front of him. Is it stealing my ether? Jake felt a shiver of horror as he felt his strength ebb away. Just when he thought he couldn't resist any longer, the feeling of tiredness suddenly stopped worsening. With his Murtharian sight, he noticed that indeed those points of light had stopped leaking from his body. Whatever the enemy's intentions were, the goal had been achieved. Immediately teleporting away from the monster, Jake used his new ether skill for the first time in sad circumstances. Huffing and puffing, he watched, sweaty and pale-faced, as the monster's severed arm seemed to evaporate into a bluish mist, which merged seconds later with the main body. With its body intact again, it was as if Jake's epic strike had never happened. After that, the rank 9 digester lay still as a statue, waiting patiently to be struck again. The other refugees gulped when they saw this, but at least they knew now that this thing did not want them dead. The only trouble was that due to Jake and Grash's sallow complexion, they were reluctant to approach this creature. However, under the gloomy gaze of their leader, they stopped hesitating. Fine, it's just a strike. The old man growled as he stepped forward with his spear. Taking a deep breath, he hurled his spear with all his might like a javelin. After seeing how Jake had suffered in hand-to-hand combat, he had elected instead for a ranged attack. It was fairly ingenious, but alas, he did not escape his retribution either. A blink after the spear disappeared into the monster's chest, Ingrainus turned pale and fell to his knees coughing up a pool of blood. It was only after he had rested for a good minute, gasping for breath, that he managed to stand up, his clothes drenched in sweat. The old man's recklessness confirmed to the other refugees that they too were in no danger, and each in turn began to attack the creature. Jake didn't like it, but unfortunately he had no better option. If it wasn't for the fact that this digester refused to attack them, most of them would have been dead long ago. One by one, the refugees executed their rudimentary attacks. Some tried to use a revolver of which they had preciously kept the bullets. Others charged fearlessly with their swords, axes, and spears in hand like Jake and Grash earlier, while Svara sent her 4 shadow wolves to bite the enemy in the hope that they would suffer the corporal punishment in her stead. Will, who hated fighting, also swung his sword with a disgusted look on his face while his dragon belched a dense stream of blue flames at the digester to no avail. None of this changed the outcome. Bullets, weapons, fire, and even Svara's shadow wolves vanished without a trace in the monster's body. Each time, whether the attack was in close combat or at a distance, physical or mystical, the attackers suffered a violent backlash. Their faces turned pale, a taste of blood filled their mouths, while an irrepressible dizziness threatened to make them faint. The most disturbing thing was that everyone experienced the same symptoms regardless of their stats. While everyone sacrificed an attack to the enemy, Jake meticulously examined his body and his spirit body, not forgetting to check his oracle status, and after a while he came to a terrible conclusion. My bloodline, my ether, body and soul stats all weakened slightly. It was no big deal if it was only his ether or body stats. As annoying as it was, he could always make up for the loss with time and perseverance. The weakening of his bloodline was much more concerning, but fortunately the difference was barely noticeable. With enough heat and radiation, he would recover in a day or two. This shouldn't be allowed to happen again, Jake thought with a brooding mood. He wasn't the only one worried. After enduring that backlash, anyone eager to relive that feeling of being drained surely had a screw loose. As the last refugee finished his attack, Jake and the others became vigilant again, preparing for the worst, but then, as promised by Grash, the rank 9 digester lost interest in them. Jake scanned the ground with his mental sense, and then his bracelet before declaring, "It's gone." Once the monster was gone, the accumulated tension dissipated all at once, and many of the refugees collapsed like puppets whose strings had been cut. The others cheered in celebration of their survival. Phew! Will wiped off the sweat on his face as he let his baby dragon carry him around. You'd have to stop depending on your big lizard. Svara didn't mince her words as she saw the businessman's laziness. In response, the big lizard snorted as he spewed a cloud of black smoke from his nostrils. As for Jake, He remembered that he still had one last piece of business to take care of, and he took off with a sonic boom to look for a certain deserter. The screams of agony and gunfire seemed to have diminished in frequency and intensity on the side of the three factions, a sign that their battle was also nearing its end. Flying silently, he wasted one more scan to locate Kyle and heaved a relieved sigh when he found him standing at the edge of the three factions' camp, hidden behind a bush. It was hard to believe, but he hadn't completely lost his mind yet. Landing stealthily behind him, Jake caught sight of him spying on the enemy camp with a complicated expression on his face. Following his gaze, he saw that he was staring at a certain young woman who bore a slight resemblance to him. Most likely aware of his arrival, Kyle suddenly began to speak with a guilty tone. I just came here to see if she was okay. I didn't intend to charge around like a moron unless, of course. Well. Walking to his friend's side, Jake stared at Maeve, then at Buzzcock with a thoughtful expression. She's stronger than I thought. She didn't suffer any injury. It's my sister for you, Kyle exclaimed proudly before relapsing into melancholy. Buzzcock protected her. As much as I hate that lowlife, he seems to care about my sister. As long as he does, she will be safe. Just after saying these words, Jake and Kyle saw the barbarian dragging the young woman into his tent, and guttural moans and groans soon came out. The playboy immediately turned red with anger. Ahem, let's go, Jake said, scratching his chin to mask his embarrassment. Chapter 538, Who Deserves to Live? I'm going to kill this motherfucker. Kyle threw caution to the wind and drew his sword, his face so congested and flushed with hatred that he looked like he was about to keel over. Jake immediately sensed that the situation was about to turn sour and attempted to talk him down. But as he mulled over his next words, he was startled to find the playboy no longer at his side. Where Kyle had been standing a second earlier, the plump, ovoid leaves of the bush he was hiding behind were swaying wildly in testimony to the turbulence they had experienced. As a top-tier third ordeal player, Jake found it hard to believe that someone like Kyle could escape his senses, but it had happened. With a solemn expression, he focused his gaze on his surroundings, and it was only by squinting narrowly that he was able to capture the silhouette of his comrade with his eyes. Kyle was neither invisible nor fast, but Jake had to concentrate hard not to lose sight of him. If he got distracted for even a moment, he would have to start from scratch. It reminds me of Bryce's faint presence. Is this a new ether skill? Jake postulated in his mind with a wistful look before remembering that this was not the time to dither. Stretching his hand out in front of him, he flexed his fingers slightly like talons, and an intense telekinetic pull enveloped the air around the playboy, causing him to lift off the ground and fly backwards against his will. Before he could adjust his course, Jake was already holding him firmly with his free hand by the scruff of the neck. Let go of me. I'm begging you, if you're not going to help me, at least don't get in my way. Kyle blazed at him with an incensed face. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was shaking so hard it was hard to tell if it was anger or because he was holding back tears. Fool. Jake slapped the back of his head ruthlessly. Let me guess your plan. You think because Buzzcock is fornicating with your sister that he'll be too distracted to smell you coming. With your sneak skill, you think you can snuck up on him and slit his throat seamlessly, right? Good plan, but too naive. Look around you. Sure, they lost a third of the refugees in the previous battle, but they were small fry. His core members may be livid and wobbly from dealing with the rank 9 digesters, but none of them died. They look like they're about to collapse. But if you weren't so obsessed with saving your sister, you'd have noticed that none of them have let go except their leader. Flagging down a large alien with big elephant ears, he interjected, Look at this one. His eyes are closed and he seems to be dozing, but his ether fluctuations are unnaturally intense, while his ears twitch routinely for the slightest sound. Kyle cringed as he realized what Jake was getting at, but Jake had no intention of stopping there. Pointing to a huge, fat jackal-like creature the size of an ox, he drove the nail in mercilessly. Look at that one. It looks like a wild beast like the others, but its eyes are cunning and its attitude is different from its fellow creatures. It sniffs the air at regular intervals and has already turned toward us half a dozen times since I arrived. We've long since been spotted. Kyle's face sank as he accepted the reality. If he had really sneaked in for a blitzkrieg ambush, he probably would have been captured before ever reaching Buzzcock's tent. Then the consequences for him and his sister would have been unimaginable. Just thinking about it gave him goosebumps. Just to make sure the playboy wasn't faking his shameful, guilty attitude, Jake laid it on thick. Actually, never mind. He flicked his hand as if he were swatting a fly in front of him. I'm sure Buzzcock isn't as dumb as he wants you to believe. Even if he was, at least one of those evolvers must have a good head on his shoulders. Do you really think that after an assault like that they're not on their toes? Indeed, it was impossible unless this entire faction was filled with complete morons. Convinced, Kyle's shoulders drooped in despondency, and he looked down shamefully. I'm sorry. I know where I'm wrong. It's good that you know. Jake chided him curtly, only to soften the next sentence. I know that what you and your sister are going through is horrible, and I can't imagine how I would react if it were Anya in her place. But that's why your friends are here. To keep you from screwing up when you can't help it. Patting his shoulders, he said, Let's go home. Kyle gave one last tortured look toward Buzzcock's tent from which his sister's muffled moans were still leaking out before walking away with a gloomy look on his face. It's just a matter of time, he muttered, clenching his fist before disappearing into the forest behind Jake. Back at their camp, Jake found Will with a graphics tablet and a stylus in hand, taking inventory of their loot. He hadn't had time to change and was still pale from the sound blast he'd taken at close range, but his enthusiasm was genuine. Managing, inventorying, merchandising, and redistributing the loot after battle was the field where he could truly shine. You're back. Will nodded as he continued to fiddle around on his tablet with extreme dedication. Not having the slightest intention of stealing the work his comrade was doing very well, Jake left him alone and instead turned his attention to the current state of the camp and their casualty figures. We lost 12 refugees, 9 of them to the rank 9 digester. Svara reported blankly as she guided him to the mass grave they had dug. Who gave the order to dig this hole? Jake wondered with a confused frown. Nobody. The refugees did it on their own. She replied with a sad smile. Jake was silent for a few seconds, then sighed. That's stupid. All they had to do was ask, and we could have stored their remains in the faction vault. If these bodies are buried here in Digester's territory, they'll be digested before the next sunset for sure. I'll tell Will to take care of it. In the meantime, tell them to stop digging and get some rest. Very well. Kyle followed Jake with his head down, but neither Will nor Svara made any comment. Although the urge to admonish him was certainly there, they knew from his downcast countenance that their leader had already taken care of that. At the sight of the 9 dead refugees, Kyle was temporarily stunned and his guilt grew even more acute. If he had stayed and fought with them instead of sneaking out, maybe some of them would still be alive right now. Jake continued strolling through the camp among the refugees, and although he was desperate to seclude himself to rest, he forced himself to exchange a few pleasantries with each survivor, consoling or uplifting them depending on what their spirits needed most. Kyle was inwardly shocked that a self-centered ruffian like their leader could actually socialize properly, but he refrained from making the remark out loud. In fact, it was a pleasant surprise. He seemed more human this way, reducing the invisible distance between them. Jake also congratulated the few refugees who had performed well. In Grayness, the Bolt's guffaws could be heard throughout the camp, and he accepted the leader's praise with immense pride. In one battle, his ether strength and agility were already nearing 100 points. Jake and his friends had forgotten how easy it was to get their ether stats up in the beginning, but it was once they reached 100 that the real challenge would begin. After that, it was just a long and tedious grinding, and without adequate bloodlines, encodings, or ether skills, it could even become an insurmountable challenge. Nikolai, Dickon, and Takayaki were also doing well, as evidenced by their elated grins and blood-covered clothes. Well, with its octopus body, it was hard to judge for Takoyaki, but it clearly looked happy. Jake and Kyle eventually made it to the edge of the crater left by the rank 9 Digester's landing, and he was disturbed when he spotted Kelly and the orphan boy sobbing while hugging the balding man's corpse. Apparently, he had not joined the pit with the other bodies. Saying nothing, he observed the rigid, astonished, but unexpectedly valiant and determined face of this man before experiencing a strange feeling. As if the young woman knew what was bothering him, she said, Uncle Barty never held a weapon in his life, never raised his voice at anyone. He was a loving husband and a good man before this whole thing happened, but he was such a nice guy that he got picked on by everybody. When his wife died at the hands of the digesters, he could have given up and forgotten his principles. But he took it upon himself to take care of me and call who were orphaned when he didn't have to. While he was terrified to the point of shuddering, he still stepped in front of that digester to save me. If we follow your logic, Uncle Barty didn't deserve to be saved, but in that case I would be dead too. Can you be so sure that no one you know is like Uncle Barty? Maybe they will die too because someone like you refused to save them. Jake thought of his Uncle Kalen and his face fell. His uncle was definitely not a fighter. Chapter 539 Welcome Pack. Jake felt a pang of guilt as he thought about what might transpire if someone were to treat his uncle the same way under similar circumstances, but he quickly shrugged off his remorse. He would never let that happen. The difference between the late Barty and his uncle was that he had no one to rely on. Also, his Uncle Kalen was not so weak-minded. When necessary, he could even be devilishly perceptive and callous when it came to his own personal affairs, his loved ones, and most especially his daughter. The reality was that there were no weaklings amongst the Wilderths. However, Jake surprised himself by considering the possibility. If tomorrow his sister Anya was judged as worthless or too weak by a bunch of evolvers considerably stronger than her, would she be left to her own devices and doomed for the same reasons? This eventuality could not be ruled out. Despite his hypocrisy and outward composure, Jake knew he was no different from Kyle. If it was his sister who was being abused and she died because some bastard refused to protect her, this guy's faction would have to suffer his wrath. That was just the sort of petty and resentful guy he was. In the end, it wasn't the death of this Uncle Barty that tugged at his heartstrings, but the streaming tears of the two orphans stricken by grief. As he stood there gazing at them as they wept their eyes out, his throat choked with shame and he felt the need to apologize. "I'm sorry, really," he croaked in a hoarse voice. "Maybe Barty did deserve to live, and I'm in the wrong. Weakness or cowardice shouldn't be flaws that dictate whether people live or die. In a less chaotic time and setting, I'm sure his other qualities would have shown through." Surprised by his sincerity, the two orphans stared at him dumbfounded. "To us, Uncle Barty shone like a beacon in the night. His qualities were always evident to us," Kelly retorted as she stopped sobbing. Closing the eyes of the balding man to let him rest in peace, she grabbed Call by the hand and stood up. It was only after she dried her tears and regained her surly, rebellious look that Jake noticed she was actually quite pretty. In her high school or college, she probably would have made people turn heads. He couldn't help but feel homesick when he thought back to his own school days. Sensing his insistent gaze, the young woman glared at him scornfully, and Jake immediately carried the body of the deceased into the faction vault to ease his awkwardness in front of their shocked eyes. It was the first time they had seen someone use a space storage skill right before their eyes. "We'll give your Uncle Barty a decent burial if we get out of this hellhole alive." Jake chuckled embarrassedly. Regaining his seriousness, he changed the subject. "I have a question. Why are you still alive? Even though Barty sacrificed himself to push you out of the crater, you were too close to the rank 9 digester. Will, who was even farther away than you were, almost died instantly because of that monster's shriek." Realizing that their virtually unharmed survival was indeed suspicious, Kelly began to panic and unconsciously squeeze Call's hand that she was holding, making him squeal in pain. The child immediately started bawling again, but Jake had seen enough. "I had forgotten that small children receive an ether skill from the Oracle to compensate for their low odds of survival," he commented unconcernedly before patting the kid's head in sympathy, which shrank shyly at his touch. "You don't have to worry. There are other kids in my faction. Whatever your ether skill is, it means nothing to me." With a nod, he greeted Kelly and then finally headed back to his tent. Kyle, who had not said a word during the whole process, also ruffled the boy's dirty hair, then threw a compassionate look at the two orphans before leaving them alone as well. "Are you really planning to help these refugees?" The playboy revealed the crux of his thinking as he followed him back to the entrance of his tent. Although Jake was usually cold and aloof, Kyle obviously knew he was more empathetic and caring than he let on, but he had a long way to go to deserve the title of saint. In his opinion, Jake's guilt was undue. He didn't have to apologize to these people. "Why not?" Jake replied vaguely. "I initially had no intention of moving a finger before sorting the wheat from the chaff, but in the end it doesn't matter. I can help them and it won't cost me much. Whether they are grateful to me, helpful or not, or even traitors in the making, none of that is relevant. If they want to disobey or betray me, I will kill them no matter how strong and reckless they become because of my generosity. If it increases the chances of survival for the good guys, then it's worth it. But, Kyle protested before pausing, not really sure how to get his point across. I know what you were trying to say, but it's not necessary. Jake cut him off calmly. If I was running out of ether, I obviously would have acted differently. But Kelly convinced me, or rather Barty convinced me. Some of the most despicable losers can hide a heart of gold beneath the grime that covers them. Others may be mischievous and hateful, but they may have a unique talent that we may sorely need in the future. They say that goodness ends when you start harming yourself. Giving a few million ether points to boost their stats can't hardly be considered a sacrifice on my part. The purgatory produces 1 billion ether points a day, Kyle, you know? My previous stance was simply shallow and immature, and it reminds me of the aloof and condescending attitude of those multi-billionaires that I loathe. Even though I'm selfish and don't care about the rest of the world, I still don't want to become a person like that. Kyle's furrowed eyebrows relaxed as he heard his whole reasoning. He thought Jake was acting on a whim, but apparently he had thought it through. His caring nature also proved that he was not indifferent to what he and his sister were going through. Reassured, he wished him a good night and retired to his own tent. The rest of the night went smoothly, and when they woke up, it was the same stormy sky that greeted them. It wasn't as dark as last night, but there was barely enough light for them to find their way without tripping or falling into a ravine. The refugees ate their breakfast in silence, deep in thought as they waited for their leader to give the order to set out again. With all the digesters they had killed, they had no shortage of fresh meat, but it was a shame they weren't allowed to light a campfire, or they would have definitely started a barbecue. Will and Svara had not slept a wink, as had most of the felines, but they were the ones who had volunteered to do so. The merchant didn't trust anyone to tally and count the loot, and the felines had long been trained to butcher and process digesters' remains without damaging any of the materials. Kyle woke up an hour after sunrise, followed closely by Jake. The refugees held back from rebuking them for sleeping in, but their faces spoke volumes. Of course, neither of them had closed an eye all night. Kyle was too restless thinking about the horrors his sister was going through to relax, while Jake never wasted a second practicing. He put on a brave front for his peers and those ignorant refugees, but only he knew how little those victories meant. His magic may have seemed awesome and all-powerful to weaker revolvers, but that was because they didn't understand how his powers worked. To Jake, generating fireballs or telekinetic barriers was as simple as moving his arm or leg. As long as the power of the spells or his mental exertion did not exceed a certain limit, it was exceedingly hard to affect his stamina. But once he encountered an opponent forcing him to fight seriously, this fatigue threshold could be crossed very quickly. The only reason he looked so glorious and overpowered against his enemies was simply because he had not yet had the misfortune to meet an opponent of his level. The rank 9 digester could have embodied this disaster, but the monster had chosen to remain peaceful to his utmost delight. Therefore, he had to keep training to prepare for this contingency. She had already told him over and over again that his fighting techniques were inferior and that he lacked experience. He fooled the world with his high intelligence and agility, but there was a limit to what natural talent could accomplish. Facing a martial arts master with the same stats as him, he would undoubtedly be at a disadvantage. As soon as Jake appeared in plain sight, all eyes locked on him, and remembering what he had planned to say, he cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone." He smiled as he glanced briefly at Kelly, who was munching on her meat at a distance. "First of all, congratulations to everyone for still being alive. I know how hard it was for some of you to overcome your fears." A few refugees cheered as they received the compliment. "Unfortunately, the losses we suffered could have been avoided. After thinking about it, I decided to make a gesture. After all, I am now your leader, and you are part of my faction. Now, come forward each in turn to receive your welcome pack." Chapter 540 Global Power-Up. The reactions differed from refugee to refugee, but all of them, without exception, blinked a few times as if they couldn't believe their ears. Even his longtime companions like Will and Kyle did not hide their surprise. Kyle had already been more or less prepared for such an announcement, but it was quite different to think about it and actually see it come true. Jake wasn't one to waste his time or anyone else's. After that short speech, he immediately honored his promises. He'd had plenty of time during the night to chat with she and fiddle with his wristband, and had already found a practical solution for distributing those welcome packs. The faction vault could apparently also be used to store dematerialized resources like ether. There was a limit to the number of ether types allowed, and just like their Oracle devices, there was a number of slots dedicated for this purpose. Fortunately, the skill was already level 5, and all the ether types owned by him and his comrades combined were not nearly enough to fill all those slots. That wasn't his intention anyway, for the time being at least. It was a shame he had let his companions keep their respective grade 2 ether encodings so as not to damage their bond, because he could have really used them right now. Alas, this kind of thing could not be rushed. To obtain these higher grade ether encodings, they had spent their precious ordeal credits or ether points, and it was already good enough that they agreed to collaborate by putting their assets in common. The only known exception was Will, who still hadn't offered his charisma encoding services to the rest of the faction, but Jake knew him well enough to know that it wasn't out of malice, but rather out of an inferiority complex. Without these grade 2 ether encodings, Jake could only offer them normal ether and some grade 1 sharpening and hardening gray ether. With some manipulation, Jake deposited enough ether in the faction vault to fulfill his ambitions and accredited the new probationary members to access the faction vault in order to withdraw the quantities of ether and resources included in his welcome pack. In all, the welcome pack contained 12,700 ether points and 300 gray ether points, enough to max out their 7 main ether stats at 100 points, including extrasensory perception, as well as enough gray ether to strengthen and sharpen up to 3 weapons. With this ether, even those who failed to score a kill during the past battle would have no excuse. In addition to this ether, Jake had dedicated 20 cubic meters of the faction vault space to these new members, which he partitioned into 100 identically sized mini-cubes. Each of these refugees now had the equivalent of a large backpack-sized space storage unit in which to store food, water, and whatever else they wanted to cram in. Of course, the remaining 140 cubic meters were reserved for him and his companions. They had recruited 61 players during the third ordeal, 62 including Sigmar, but they were not yet entitled to use the faction vault for the time being. Their recruitment was tied to special circumstances, and Jake didn't know if they intended to stay. Therefore, he could only treat them as suspicious outsiders until their probationary period was over. For most of these refugees, it was the first time they had earned so much ether at once, and most were so rapt and emotional that tears of joy were dripping down their faces. Others were just flabbergasted, unable to reconcile their sudden good fortune with their miserable lives of the past months. Lastly, a few were more pragmatic and just soberly thanked him before taking out their ether to upgrade their stats. It took a little longer for these refugees to learn how to use their space storage. Without having awakened the extrasensory perception stat, it was impossible to materialize and control one's spirit body, let alone mobilize one's consciousness from a distance. Mentally accessing the space storage dimension to deposit and remove objects was therefore out of their reach for the moment. But others were in less of a hurry and chose to improve their stats first. Thanks to this meteoric power-up, a good half naturally awakened their 7th stat and managed to access their space storage after becoming familiar with their new mental abilities. The other half, however, were unable to experience that feeling of transcendence. Even after maxing out their intelligence and perception, their extrasensory perception stat refused to unlock. They were just better humans, but without any supernatural abilities. This made Jake realize that the condensation of the soul and spirit body was not just a matter of ether stats, and that there were probably other conditions that had to be met to awaken this 7th stat. Intuitively, and from his own experience, it surely had to do with the mental strength and resolve of an individual, and strong emotions were perhaps necessary to trigger this spirit transmutation. It should not be forgotten that, at the root, consciousness was only the result of some electrical connections in a network of neurons. Half an hour later, the refugees had begun to recover from their emotions, and Jake ordered them to break camp. Those who had awakened their 7th stat were in an excellent mood and were instantly recognizable by their smug faces, while the others were a bit more taciturn but still much more optimistic and confident than the day before. I'm surprised at your decision, Will confessed as he walked beside him once on the road. Svara bobbed her head vigorously to signify her assent. Jake laughed at how little humanity they were giving him. Do you really think I'm heartless? He asked seriously after a while as he noticed that their bafflement didn't seem to abate. Yep, Svara replied matter-of-factly. You enslaved me after all. Jake rolled his eyes and retorted crisply. But I released you once the ordeal was over. It was just a precaution. In the end, you joined us of your own free will. If I am a heartless person, doesn't that make you a masochist? Will smiled as he listened to their bickering, but that didn't stop him from saying his piece. Next time, I'd like to be in the loop so I can plan the distribution of all this. It shouldn't be the leader's job to take care of this sort of thing. Jake gave the man an exasperated look before reluctantly agreeing. In the end, it suited him. No matter how ambitious Will was, he could not take his place. The mirror universe was not a place where the weak could depose an emperor with only schemes and money. Overwhelming strength was the absolute prerequisite. For the next few hours, the group tracked the footprints of the three factions a few miles ahead of them. The latter had broken camp before them, and the welcome packs distribution had put them even further behind. This was not in vain, though, for the increased fitness of the refugees allowed them to step up their pace substantially, and they soon caught sight of the stragglers from the three factions again. The weather had deteriorated further if that was possible, and a fine, slightly acidic shower was now raining down on their faces. It wasn't enough to hurt them, but the rain made their faces itch unpleasantly. Pale green lightning bolts occasionally streaked the sky, releasing a deafening thunderous rumble and startling the most impressionable. The only good news was that the digesters were nowhere in sight. Twice, Jake and his group witnessed the spawn of a rank 1 digester, but with the refugee power-up neither Jake nor his companions had to move a finger. For the first one, an axe whirled through the air and raised a slight gust of wind in its path before splitting the not yet fully materialized monster's skull in two. The goblin Zort had flung this axe. The second time, the newborn digester was played to death by Kal and the CC1's sons, the red-headed prostitute. With their new powers, they were not so weak anymore, and Jake had the opportunity to appreciate the incredible adaptability of these children. Ironically, it was sometimes the adults who were supposed to be more mature who had the hardest time adapting to change. The children were more accepting of the situation. Without the fear tugging at their stomachs, they would soon regain their playing instincts and start to enjoy life again. Mauling digesters was certainly not ideal for their psychological development, but Jake had to deal with the times. In the early afternoon, they suffered another assault. There was no warning, and no shrill cackling from any of the three factions to prepare for it. If the refugees had not boosted their stats and equipment, there would certainly have been some casualties. The horde consisted of over 20,000 rank 1 to 3 digesters, and even from up in the sky this army of monsters seemed endless, like a grayish torrent sweeping through the forest of ash that they roamed like a swarm of hungry locusts. The battle lasted more than an hour, and no powerful digesters made an appearance. Under these conditions, Jake and the felines decided to fight normally alongside the others without using any strong ether spells. The goal was to give these refugees a chance to gain experience and build up their still fragile backbone. It was also a good opportunity to observe them and understand their characters and talents. By the end of the battle, some of them had already stood out from the crowd. Chapter 541 Promising Recruits. Ingranus, the old man, had become accustomed to his new fitness, and with his spear optimally sharpened by gray ether, he had started to fully display his skills as a lancer. His past as a knight no longer seemed an empty lie. Nikolay, the blonde Aegean, had no distinctive elemental affinity like some of his people, but perhaps he had never been given the chance to awaken this trait. In the mirror universe, the elemental particles abounding in EGA's atmosphere were all but absent, so he could only rely on his ether and body stats to fight. Despite this, his origins from a medieval world ensured that he had a decent physical condition and rudimentary fighting skills. Compared to other refugees, he was relatively comfortable with his sword. Dickon, his fighting buddy, was a short, stocky, hairy guy who had a sharp tongue, but he sure had plenty of courage to spare. On his home world, the planet Exor, he must have been a lumberjack or something like that, because he was pretty handy with his axe. By dint of slaughtering monsters, he was getting the hang of it, and even appeared to be enjoying it. Takayaki, the octopus alien, was probably the one who benefited the most from his power-up. Being more adapted to the ocean than to land, his physical condition was poor, and despite his humanoid appearance, he was still an invertebrate. He had no skeleton to resist gravity and support his body, so his muscles worked hard to hold his body together by constantly contracting. With the Murtharian body passive and his new ether stats, he had regained a high degree of mobility. With his tentacle arms, he could manipulate several weapons at once, and each of his limbs contained a peripheral brain, giving him exceptional coordination. In terms of dexterity and learning potential, this alien was undoubtedly superior to humans. The old goblin couple, Zort and Nis, on the other hand, were limited by their age and small stature, but it was not for nothing that these creatures had a bad reputation in folklore and modern literature. Favoring the use of daggers and curved blade cutlasses, their attacks were vicious and sordid, striking directly at the private parts. Jake didn't know if the digesters had genitals, but he couldn't help but feel genuine compassion for their victims. Kelly and her adopted brother Call had gotten close to Svara, who seemed intent on taking them under her wing. Under her supervision, she had begun to fight like a tigress. The death of the balding man was still fresh in her memory, and each of her moves was filled with rage and resentment. They gave her an inexhaustible energy and valiance. As for Call, he may have been only 7-8 years old, but his passive ether skill was as breathtaking as you would expect from an oracle gift. The digesters, notorious for their devouring appetites and deep-seated hostility to any species other than their own, tended to ignore him and focus on the other refugees nearby, especially Kelly. If one of these monsters did end up attacking him, very often the attack lacked enthusiasm and punch. However, this ether skill was far from invincible. How could such a skill be given away for free, even to help a helpless child? If there was one thing Jake knew for sure, it was that the Oracle was not a philanthropist. There was a limit to his generosity, and he never acted without reason. In any case, Call could be called talented. He was one of the refugees who had spontaneously awakened his 7th stat, and with each passing second, he was becoming more adept at controlling and perceiving ether. His unique ether skill, which had previously been passive, had become more proactive, and he was already influencing rank 1 digesters to make crucial tactical mistakes. A little more, and he might soon be able to control them like puppets. Not bad. Jake nodded as he watched the kid. They could make the kid a crowd control mage or something if that proclivity were to become more apparent in the days to come. Elsewhere on the battlefield, CC1, the former red-headed prostitute, had also begun to walk a new path where fear and hesitation had no place. She still feared for her children's lives, but they were now fighting alongside her. Older than Call, these two boys had a composure comparable to Tim after his first ordeal. At school, Jake was willing to bet that they were the rambunctious, daredevil type. In addition to these refugees, there were also a dozen others who showed promise. The first was this creepy orange turkey with a helmet on his head. Flanked by an army of chickens and other fowl that Jake didn't include in the count of refugees under his protection, this turkey was leading them into war with unwavering ferocity. Gobbling like a fierce king, Jake and the others regularly had to duck their heads to avoid the flock of birds battling overhead. With their increased strength, the turkey and other birds were now powerful enough to fly, and they had a field day. Having repressed months of dread and anguish waiting to be turned into nuggets, their instinct for revenge was overwhelming, and with no better option, it was the digesters who became their scapegoat. Apart from Jake, they respected no one, and this turkey was so arrogant that he dared to stand up to Mufasa and Shere Khan. These chickens already had the aura of an established criminal gang, and he could only commend their courage, or rather their complete lack of self-preservation. Were they even aware that if the cats weren't so well fed, they would have just eaten them? Shaking his head, Jake froze in disbelief as he watched them bully a rank 2 digester, swooping down on him like a pack of piranhas. Don't you have any dignity? In addition to this turkey and his minions, there was also a Saint Bernard dog, the green buffalo, and a couple of other alien creatures that showed signs of keen intellect. The others were too stupid and had not followed them out of the shelter. As for the humans and aliens, most had killed at least one digester, but not everyone had the potential to become a top-tier evolver. Jake could tell at a glance which of them would eventually become powerful players. Of course, that was only if they could make it that far. Still, there was one true coward among these refugees, the hustler. If Grash hadn't portrayed such a good picture of this guy, Jake would have definitely discarded it and let him die like the trash he was. If he hadn't changed his mind after Barty's sacrifice, his fate would have been sealed. He was one of 3 refugees whose weapons still glistened like new. No trace of silver blood had marred their blades. Right now, he was hiding with the other 2 aliens in the middle of the camp, burying his head in the sand under a pile of luggage so as not to draw attention to himself. Fortunately for them, Jake and the other refugees were too busy to deal with them, but their cowardice and obnoxious attitude had already made itself known among the group. They were drawing the majority of the refugees' glares at them, and even they could sense that they were no longer welcome. If they didn't at least pretend to fight, they would sooner or later be ostracized. The only consolation for the scammer was that he had Grash's favor, or at least the cleaning alcohol in his possession had. The pig orc had dedicated himself body and soul to protect him against all common sense. The giant alien being stronger than him, Jake could only turn a blind eye to his stupidity. So be it. With his con man profile, maybe they could do something about him by capitalizing on his strengths. Luck or charisma ether might be a good build for this guy. He would have to discuss it with Tim when he returned. The battle ended without any unpleasant surprises a few minutes later. The confrontation had been bloody and tedious for the refugees, but this time Jake smiled in satisfaction as he flew over the battlefield. 0 casualties. Familiar with the procedure after the previous assault, Will gave a series of orders, and everyone pitched in to clean up, label, store, and redistribute the loot according to everyone's needs. The ether due to everyone was also absorbed by those who had not had time to take care of it during the battle. Well-versed in human and alien psychology, Will knew how to motivate the troops and made sure that each refugee received a fair share of the loot. After the hard battle, they were exhausted and out of breath, but they were all, without exception, a little richer than before. They all had a proud and contented smile on their faces. After that, they set off again. Kyle hadn't deserted this time, but knowing he was worried sick, Jake had immediately offered to investigate the situation of the 3 factions. Taking the Playboy with him, they had flown the distance to Buzzcock and the other leaders in an instant. The apocalyptic vision of their camp made them draw a sharp breath. Another quarter of the refugees had died during this second assault. Having already lost a third during the first attack, the numerical gap had begun to widen and the refugees had paid a heavy price. If the 4th ordeal evolvers had not stepped up their game, the casualties would have been far greater. Fortunately, they spotted the graceful figure of Maeve in the distance. Her face was sallow and filled with despair, but at least she was unharmed. Reassured, Kyle breathed a sigh of relief and they returned to their own camp. Chapter 542, United We Stand. Over the next 3 days, the 4 factions were ambushed 5 more times, each time on a larger scale. In the last attack, the horde consisted of nearly 30,000 digesters, with a few rank 4s leading them. At the same time, each of these assaults resulted in numerous casualties among the 3 factions despite their change in policy. Although the high-level evolvers were now actively participating in the fighting, it was not enough to completely ensure the safety of the remaining refugees. Fortunately, even a herbivore would eventually learn to bite after such violent and repeated assaults. Under the suffocating and life-threatening pressure of the digesters, these once weak and spineless refugees had shed their former cowardly skins and turned into ferocious kamikazes. When one had nothing left to lose, one could accomplish anything. Alas, Buzzcock and Shackler were not Jake and did not invite these predominantly slave contract refugees into their faction. Even if they had, these 2 aliens were too selfish and conceited to share one of their best bloodline skills with their subordinates. Their faction skills were chosen because they brought them personal benefits and were nowhere near as life-changing as Jake's Murtharian body passive. The truth was that these 2 leaders didn't care about the fate of their subordinates as long as they could reap the benefits of their sacrifice. The direct consequence was that after 7 consecutive assaults, there were only a few hundred refugees left under their command, barely more than Jake's faction. Counting their regular members, which included about 200 evolvers with between 2 and 4 ordeals under their belt. Their main force was still intact. Melkree fared a little better. Her faction being originally neutral, she was slightly inferior to her two rivals and was anyway known for taking care of her subordinates. Her refugees, slaves or not, were invited to join her faction as soon as they were received. Her faction passive skill was called regenerative photosynthesis and allowed her members to regenerate their stamina and recover quickly from their injuries as long as there was decent light, water, and soil nearby. At level 4, this skill accelerated these biological processes by up to 25% of the real skill, enough to make them 4 to 6 times more resilient than normal refugees. In other words, if the environmental conditions were met, their body vitality would get a significant boost. For this reason, all members of Melkree's faction, veteran evolvers and refugees alike, had imitated her foul-smelling style and roughly covered their bodies with mud, leaving just enough skin exposed to the sun to activate photosynthesis. Right now, this faction looked like primitive savages who had lived underground all their lives. But the facts were there. Their casualty figures were 50% lower than those of Buzzcock and Shackler's factions. The two egocentric aliens were beginning to regret their past choices as they watched their forces gradually dwindle. Conversely, if there was one big winner among these four factions, it was Jake's. His change of heart had paid off. With the boost from their new ether and body stats, these refugees had suffered almost no casualties in the first few assaults, and that gave them the time they needed to build up their experience. Besides, neither Jake nor Grash, nor the felines were the type to watch their subordinates die without lifting a finger. Faced with so many digesters, how could they sit back and do nothing? Jake had also taken another decisive step in the last few days, one that proved to have a major benefit not only to these refugees, but also to older members like Kyle and Svara. He had chosen the fourth faction skill. Sadly, it wasn't possible to choose another of his bloodline skills, but at level 5 there were a bunch of interesting options to choose from. There were of course plenty of auxiliary faction skills increasing the output of their floating islands, ether cores, and structures, reducing the price of items in the Oracle store, or giving them certain privileges in the Oracle cities, etc. But these kinds of skills were a waste for a combat-oriented main faction. These types of assets were best reserved for sub-factions with a non-military role, like Will's Murtharian Scavengers sub-faction. The second type of faction skills were those favored by individualistic leaders like Buzzcock and Shackler. These were active or passive skills that gave immediate and unquestionable advantages to their members. Generally speaking, they were far inferior to the first faction skill and usually cost quite a bit of ether. Some of these passive faction skills included doping, which increased body stats by 5% per level at a cost of 100,000 ether points per hour or 5,000 per minute, and steel body, which made skin as hard as steel for the same price. For a powerful and rich evolver, these faction skills could be activated 24 hours a day. Poorer members, on the other hand, could only lament looking at these skills with envy. They were accessible with a click, but without the ether required for activation, these skills would be forever grayed out. Active faction skills were even more breathtaking, but usually had an absurd activation cost. Most often, they directly tapped into the ether stored by the faction itself and could only be activated by the leader and authorized senior officers. Meteor or Lightning Strike were two examples of formidable active faction skills. They existed in a lesser form that could be used by all members at a cost of 100,000 ether points per use, and a much more dangerous form that could cost as much ether as the faction could provide. The power of these spells was proportional to the amount of ether invested and well-timed. They could eradicate evolvers deemed invincible. If Jake and his companions had stuck with a small group, he would have favored one of these skills, but their perilous circumstances had pushed him to another choice. The last type of faction skills were skills like Faction Vault or Vitality Link that benefited all members and could be used both during an ordeal and outside of it. These were the ones that provided the most benefit for their cost, and some of them, like the Faction Vault, could be considered a must-have for every faction worth its salt. The watchword for these faction skills was cooperation. They could be as fearsome as they could be useless if members refused to contribute to the group effort. For example, the Faction Vault required 100,000 ether points per day to operate, while the vitality link cost 800,000 ether points with the acknowledged risk that no member might be willing to share the injuries sustained. There were, however, even for egoists like Buzzcock, worthwhile skills like withholding ether tax. This was a leader-only skill that could be used once a month to drain up to 10% of each member's ether. This ether went directly into the faction's ether storage and could then be used to activate other skills. These types of skills clearly existed for those tyrants unable to gain the respect and voluntary contribution of their members. Buzzcock and Shactalert had partially solved this problem with slave contracts, but their strongest evolvers were clearly not subject to this regime. Obviously, Jake had no intention of becoming that kind of scoundrel, so he settled on a completely different faction skill called United We Stand. Its description was as follows. United We Stand. For each member present within 100 meters, ether, body, and soul stats will be boosted by 0.1% for each additional level. The range increases 100 meters and the boost by 0.1%. Ether cost, 1 ether points per minute. At level 5, United We Stand had a range of 500 meters in diameter and a boost of 0.5% per individual. Currently, Jake's group had 84 refugees, 16 felines, a baby dragon, plus Will, Kyle, Svara, and Jake himself. In total, that was 105 members, for an overall boost of 52.5%. This may not seem like much against the hordes of digesters they were facing, but keep in mind that this boost affected all types of stats. The effective stats were always the product of multiplying the ether stats by the body stats and divided by the local ether density, and this meant that the actual boost was naturally much higher. After acquiring this faction skill, its effects were directly felt on the battlefield. Refugees who thought they had reached a plateau after maxing out their ether stats experienced a second power-up, and it had an even more dramatic impact on their morale and confidence. With their newfound stats and faith, they molested these digesters with such zeal that a bystander would have wondered who was really the assailant of the assailed. In the end, after 3 days they had suffered almost no casualties. The few deaths were due to overconfidence and were never repeated ever since. Nevertheless, after these numerous assaults, Jake had not gotten a big head, quite the opposite in fact. Far from being proud of his victories, his sense of foreboding had increased after each battle. These victories were too easy. If one slightly weak horde could be considered plausible, 7 hordes sacrificed brainlessly, and not surprisingly, at dawn on the 4th day, they reached their destination and Jake at last understood where his bad feeling came from. Chapter 543, Follow Me. Halt. Jake frowned as he heard one of the evolvers recruited by Buzzcock shout this order in the distance. It was a voice brimming with masculine authority and loud enough to reach them, which was no small feat considering the amount of distance they kept between their group. A flock of birds perched on nearby trees took flight anarchically at the daunting yell, generating a cacophony of angry chirping that momentarily made the refugees suspect another digester attack. Exchanging a serious look with Will, Jake also took off, kicking up a geyser of dust in his wake, and stealthily flew over the spot where the 3 factions had just stopped. Manipulating the ambient photons to make himself invisible, he found an observation spot about a kilometer above the ground and proceeded to scan the surrounding landscape. The 3 factions were far too sluggish and spread out to hide themselves, even in this ash forest, and he easily found them, stationed vigilantly around a huge spiral cone-shaped structure. In fact, it was this rocky protuberance that he had first spotted. From below with the rest of his group, it had been obscured by the dense tree foliage that they were using to cover their movements. Jake should have spotted such a rock structure much earlier, but they had entered a foggy area since the day before that had only just lifted. It made one wonder if this fortuitous coincidence was auspicious, or if they were playing the game of someone else who intended to drag them here. In some aspects, this thing looked like the hull of a huge seashell, but this thing had clearly sprung up from the earth as shown by the color and the ash-gray texture of the rock covering it. It looked more like an unusual outgrowth than a mountain naturally formed by the play of local tectonic plates. What made this spiral cone structure so off-putting was not so much its shape as its excessiveness. This rocky spire was about 10 times wider than a soccer field, and its peak cut through the thick cloud cover, disappearing somewhere in the troposphere. Jake could understand why this order was given. The alien responsible for the order was of the same orc species as Grash, but with the attributes of a ferocious creature not found on Earth. Even bulkier and more muscular than Grash, this orc was shredded with pitch-black skin and long dreadlocks and braids of the same color. His ears were pointed. His long yellowish fangs had nothing to envy to those of Mufasa, while his golden irises and slit pupils sheltered a sinister and malicious glint betraying his immense experience and merciless character. To complete this fearsome portrait, this orc was covered from head to toe by a thick black armor covered with sharp spikes. It was undoubtedly a formidable evolver, possibly of the same level or higher than Grash. Jake hadn't noticed him before despite his frequent overflights of their camp, and this had the makings of a warning siren in his already wary mind. "Grash, do you know him?" Jake asked after telepathically transferring the evolver's image. "I know him. He was recruited alongside me by Buzzcock." The pig-like orc replied with embarrassment. "The terms of his contract are more favorable than mine. He is a mercenary who arrived a few days after the incident with the first rank 9 digester. He did not participate in the elimination of the next ones, but before Shackler and Melkry had time to react, he had already joined Buzzcock's camp. I don't know what Buzzcock offered him, but I don't think he is capable of commanding such an evolver. Who do you think is stronger between you two?" Jake asked the crucial question without any consideration for his naive comrade's ego. Grash gave a wry smile before answering with a sigh. "He's stronger for sure. He should be a 5th ordeal player too, but he might have completed 6. Jake became thoughtful as he took in his earnest tone. "This guy hasn't been involved in any previous attacks, or I would have noticed him. If this alien had participated in the defense of Buzzcock's camp, at least twice as many of his refugees would still be alive instead of the current 100 or so. In this regard, his relationship with the Nawai chief was probably not as good as Grash made it out to be. Judging by the current situation, it seemed more like Buzzcock was the one bending over backwards and compromising to keep him on his side. So the real question to be raised was why had he decided to show up only now and not during the previous attacks where his participation would have been sorely needed? Because he has no choice. She, who had been less than talkative lately, sneered scornfully. There must be someone or something forcing him to show up. Indeed, when Jake probed the forest around the shell, he was startled to discover the presence of many other campsites. They were remarkably well camouflaged by the cover of the ash tree's thick foliage, but such a large number of people could only be concealed for so long. The mighty orc at Buzzcock's side had obviously sniffed them out before he did. How strange. Jake stroked his chin from above as he flew over the various camps one by one. In just a few moments of flying over, he had already counted 29 different factions. Mentally calculating and combining that with what he knew about the layout of the Oracle shelters, he began to get an idea of what was going on. If I'm not mistaken, the Oracle city of the Oracle playground should be right above this spiral rocky point. Jake concluded in a whisper as he cast his gaze to the heavens. Needless to say, he found nothing but a thick layer of dark, stormy clouds. The city was orbiting at a fantastic altitude, and even if his perception was good enough, the black cube's camouflage would have made it undetectable anyway. Bingo, she agreed with his deduction. If I'm not mistaken, the censorship should be partially lifted by now. That rocky prominence should be the entrance to the dungeon digester. Delighted by the news, Jake immediately pressed her for more information. It's about time. Hey she, can you tell me a little more about it now? His Oracle AI wasn't comfortable with his outpouring of mawkishness, but it wasn't as if she didn't feel guilty about being unable to be helpful. Focusing hard, she tried to formulate a response, but all that came out of her mouth was a string of unintelligible words. I feel like the censorship is still on. She sighed and fell back into an embarrassed silence. Jake was speechless. Almost every function of the Oracle system was malfunctioning in Digester's territory, including the various cubes that would have allowed them to break out of here. But the censorship that was more of a hindrance than a helpful feature was still up and running. It made you wonder if the Oracle wasn't just messing with them. I swear that if I ever meet the asshole who programmed this system that I'll make him wear a bracelet wherein I'll censor all his sentences and replace them with, "I'm the biggest son of a bitch in the mirror universe, and I like it." Don't say that, she exclaimed in utter horror. If she still had her old body, her forehead would have been covered with beads of sweat by now. If the oracle got wind of their blasphemous thoughts, she knew better than to expect them to live. I'm not afraid. Jake grumbled to himself with a smug face, but after that brave statement, he ceased all blasphemous thoughts. Obviously, his daring had its limits. As Jake hovered over the other camps, he picked up several unfathomable ether signatures. Seen from the perspective of his Murtharian eyes, some of them were as bright as stars on a moonless night. Some of these auras even exceeded the black orcs in brightness. More than once, he narrowly missed being spotted despite his invisibility and was forced to retreat or increase his flight altitude to escape the senses of these terrifying powerhouses. As Jake wondered how the situation would evolve, the shrill cackling that had punctuated their entire journey for several days suddenly echoed in a deafening way. The number of cackles was so great that the earth began to tremble, and he almost fainted out of sheer fright when he saw the horde fast approaching on the horizon. Millions of digesters as far as the eye could see. Not ranks 1, 2, or 3, but horrific monstrosities ranging in size from several dozen meters to nearly a kilometer long. The etheric signatures were so extraordinary that they could only belong to rank 5 to 10 digesters. And as for those belonging to rank 9 and 10 digesters, he had already counted at least 1,000 of them at the very least. Holy shit. Covered in a cold sweat, Jake gave up any thought of remaining stealthy and released a deafening supersonic wave as his body shot off like a shooting star at lightning speed to where his own camp was located. Likewise, the other leaders also perceived the threat and immediately gave a series of orders to prepare for an intense battle. None of them paid any attention to him. As soon as Jake landed with his group, he felt the gazes filled with confidence and pride of his subordinates. Seeing their faith and fearlessness, he couldn't find it in himself to tell them the truth. Gritting his teeth, he weighed the pros and cons and barked, "Follow me." Chapter 544 Frantic Escape. At this very moment, their camp was one of the most outlying. This distance had been a precaution against the three factions, but now it might spell their doom. Jake had no time for hesitation. If they just stood there, they would be the first to suffer the wrath of this huge horde. If these highly evolved digesters caught up with them, even he doubted he could protect himself, let alone taking care of these refugees. It went without saying that if they didn't get the hell out of there, the most optimistic amount of survivors after their arrival would be counted on the fingers of one hand. Perhaps it was because animals have keener senses than humans, but the feline's fur bristled in unison as their usually placid gaze turned westward. Mufasa and Shere Khan were no exception, and they subconsciously snarled westward in warning. Crunch didn't even hide his fright and had already trotted hurriedly to his master with his short legs, in proportion to his size. Cuddling up to Jake in search of comfort, he received only a vigorous kick in return for his affection. This had the desired effect, though, and the big black cat stopped sticking to him like a sissy. "Can't you show a little courage?" Jake lectured him, as he firmly pressed his palm against his whisker to keep him at bay. "Duchess is watching you, you know." Upon understanding his last remark, Crunch's ears perked up in panic and he turned his head in all directions looking for his crush. Unfortunately, what he feared was true and the female leopard had witnessed his cowardly display. Meow. Disappointed, Crunch stopped begging for attention and got into a fighting stance alongside the other felines. Seeing the felines form the rear guard, posture prostrate, and staring westward, even the slowest refugees caught on and realized something was wrong. Their bombastic confidence immediately waned, and they remembered the command their leader had just issued. "Oh my God. I think this time we're screwed. Speak for yourself. I'm sure with my new powers I can take out 1,000 monsters by myself." "Yeah, I remember you said the same thing during the last attack, but in the end you almost died after killing 13 of them." "Shit, you've seen that. I thought I could take that secret to my grave." All sorts of murmurs and comments erupted among the refugees, but it was obvious from their tone that many had not yet taken the threat in full. With large veins twitching on his forehead, Jake felt his anger rising and he shouted harshly to the crowd. "Shut up and move your ass. I'm leaving now. Those who are late will be left to their own devices, and trust me, you don't want to run into what's coming." These refugees were a little slow on the uptake, but they weren't complete idiots. When they saw their leader lose his cool and turn his back on them, without hesitation they abandoned their last misgivings and shoved everything they could into the faction vault. It was a good thing they hadn't set up camp, or they would have been forced to leave most of their belongings behind. If there was one refugee even more responsive than Crunch, it was the scammer. The con man hadn't questioned his order once, and had already bolted off in the opposite direction from the felines. At least regarding his survival instinct, it could be considered top-notch. Jake held back an exasperated sigh as this unpredictable human beat him to it, and took off again. Launching a full-range scan, a strange light flashed behind his pupils as he interpreted the immense data influx, and he shouted loudly again. The Horde will be here in 48 seconds. We must reach the 3 factions before then. Follow this trajectory. Each refugee then received a notification with a highly realistic 3-dimensional map of the surrounding area and a path of light showing them the way. Augmented reality light arrows appeared before their eyes, temporarily replacing their disabled shadow guides to point the way. Mufasa and Shere Khan maintained their tough stance, but inwardly they felt a deep relief knowing that they did not have to watch the refugees' backs. They too were not confident of defeating the coming enemies. With an earth-shaking roar, Mufasa gave a final warning to the fast-approaching horde, and then by unspoken agreement he and the other felines galloped off to the east, overtaking the refugees already running as fast as they could in the blink of an eye. Seconds later, hundreds of thousands of birds flying in from the west darkened the sky, and the ground shook as tens of thousands of ruminants and creatures of various kinds rushed towards them. Among these animals were huge alien predators, insects as big as cars, and giant snakes long and wide enough to wrap themselves around a skyscraper. To survive in digester territory for so long, each of these creatures, whether carnivorous, herbivorous, warlike, or peaceful, had to have excellent qualities and dispositions. Even if these beasts were not exceptionally strong, they must have had at least one unique skill that ensured their survival, such as lightning speed, supernatural stealth, or perhaps their flesh tasted so foul that even the digesters did not want it. Whatever the case, what they all had in common at that moment was that these beasts were stampeding towards them with tongues hanging out and desperate eyes with the horde of digesters at their heels. Both predators and prey were galloping side by side with the same objective, to flee. From the air, Jake got the ugly impression that these digesters were fishermen who had decided to reel in their nets, or shepherds gathering their flocks in one place to better kill them. He wasn't the only one who thought so, but unlike him, these high-level evolvers knew what was going on. Giving their series of orders calmly, their troops set off in an orderly fashion and marched toward the huge spiral rocky prominence. Seeing them do so, Jake needed no more to imitate them. If human civilization had been able to go so far, it was by relying on the shoulders of giants and wise men who had marked history. Otherwise, it had to be said that the majority of humans did not even know how to light a fire or explain how a light bulb works. Although he was ignorant and subject to the censorship of the Oracle system, he could depend on those people who were better informed than he was to carve a way out. Shameless, she huffed in a low voice. Tell me if you want me to die, okay? Jake snapped in vexation, too tense wondering how they were going to survive the next 10 minutes to care about the method and feelings of his AI oracle. Having just been rebuffed, she felt the urge to retaliate, but she remembered their situation and refrained. She would deal with him later. Luckily, Jake had overestimated the difficulty of the task. Racing toward the rocky prominence without alarming the 3 factions or any of the other groups hiding in the forest proved incredibly simple. Each of the refugees was obedient and much stronger and enduring than before, and without having to worry about the noise they were making, they could finally give free rein to their newfound strength. For many, this was the first time they had been given the opportunity to sprint at 100% capacity, and the feeling was just too exhilarating to pass up. The gratifying rush of adrenaline that went through their heads almost made them forget about the horde of digesters chasing them. The few kilometers of distance were crossed in a few dozen seconds, but in the meantime the digesters had gotten dangerously close. They were only a few hundred meters away, a gap that these monsters could close in a few seconds. Fortuitously, and unfortunately for the creatures behind them, the first scapegoats were the animals that were running amok. Howls, Bellowing and roars of agony echoed from the back of the herd, and it felt like a whiplash to the remaining animals. Realizing that it was now or never, their muscles surged with renewed energy, and they suddenly sped up as if they had gone into a frenzy. Forget the digesters. When these refugees saw the huge beasts catching up to them at a great pace, some with teeth as long as their swords, they experienced the same surge of terror, and their running speed also picked up markedly. Grateful, Jake was almost moved to compassion by the noble gesture of these beasts, but he quickly dismissed this thought. Right now, it was his faction or them. 10 seconds later, the bulk of the horde caught up with the faster digesters and finally collided fully with the rear of the cavalcading herd of beasts. Thousands of creatures were slaughtered and eviscerated in an instant, and thousands of etheric signatures were extinguished in one fell swoop. Nevertheless, it was enough. Jake and his group reached the three factions' campground, and without skipping a beat pushed past it before their stunned eyes. The Black Orc was not so bossy, and unlike Jake, the three leaders had given the order to set up camp a little earlier. They thought they had some time to spare, but because of this they were caught off guard when they saw millions of beasts and digesters bursting out of the forest. In a panic, they were forced to abandon all their possessions on the spot and immediately started running in the same direction as Jake and his group. Now it was 4 factions and a herd of assorted beasts fleeing in the same direction. Chapter 545. Nice weapon you got there. Jake was taken aback when he stumbled upon the 3 factions. He couldn't understand why the 3 factions hadn't fled before them. Having to dismantle their camp was one thing, but was it worth more than their own lives? Even without a long-range scan, these 4 ordeal evolvers should have heard them coming from a distance. After all, they were raising a ruckus to wake the dead, and these digesters hadn't made the slightest attempt at stealth. Suspicious, Jake looked at each and every individual of the 3 factions in his field of vision and noticed a certain pattern. The Black Orc and Buzzcock are here, but many high-level evolvers are missing. Glancing over to Melcree, he noticed that her core members were still there, forming the rear guard of her troop. She seemed determined to protect all her subordinates. But then why not just run away sooner? Am I missing something? Jake didn't know what to think, and it was exacerbating his paranoid anxieties. Keeping his gloomy thoughts to himself, he tried not to overreact and focused on the path ahead. With the digesters behind them and the 3 factions on their flanks, they were surrounded by enemies. All of a sudden, his hair stood on end as he felt clang. Jake, who was on the defensive and running, had no good footing and took the blow in the worst possible posture. Worse, having neither activated bloodline ignition nor properly mobilized his ether, he was badly injured by the impact. His right arm holding the blade fractured into several pieces with loud snapping noises, and the flesh tore at the insertion between his finger and thumb. Moreover, because of his disadvantageous posture, he lost his footing and his feet flew off the ground as he followed the circular trajectory of the enemy hammer. The attack originating from his left, he slid on the ground for about 30 meters, carving a deep trench and knocking out 2 refugees of his faction in the process. Had he not mobilized his telekinesis to stop himself in a hurry, they would have been seriously injured by the collision. Despite his reflexes, the 2 refugees were thrown violently into the air and crashed heavily a few meters away, completely stunned. Under other circumstances, they would have gotten off with a few bandages and some rest, but with a herd of terrified beasts and a horde of digesters on their tail, the fall was fatal. Before they could regain their senses, they had already been outrun by the rest of the survivors and were trampled to a bloody pulp by thousands of rampaging beasts. Seeing their grisly deaths, the other refugees, regardless of their faction, broke out in a cold sweat. His face contorted with rage, Jake turned to the culprit and hollered, "Buzzcock!" The Nawai chief, transformed into his ogre form, chuckled evilly as he received an uninterrupted stream of hate. As Jake was about to take flight to avoid being trampled by the herd of frightened creatures as well, his senses were drawn to a Nawai evolver hiding behind Buzzcock. With long turquoise fluorescent hair tied into a Katogon, he was one of those rare barbarians who could be considered elegant. He was surprisingly well dressed in a pair of... This was the first time Jake had noticed such a distinguished Nawai, but he had little time to study this anomaly. No sooner had he noticed the strange sign formed with his clasped hands than his mind went blank again. When he came to his senses, the rampaging beasts were already upon him. Because of this vicious mental attack, Jake lost his only chance to avoid the collision and was also rammed into by a huge beast that looked like a cross between a triceratops and a polar bear. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs, while one of the beast's horns impaled his torso. If he hadn't wrapped his legs around the monster's huge horn, he might have been thrown to the ground and trampled by the rest of the monsters. Although his body was incomparably stronger than the two refugees, his only fate was death if he ended up under the hooves of these beasts. Jake, leader, his comrades and the other refugees cried out in dismay as they watched him get impaled by that huge beast leading the herd, but they breathed a sigh of relief as they saw him hang on tight. While they were distracted, 3 more cries of agony rang out among them, and alarmed by the noise, they saw 3 more refugees fall into a daze at the worst possible moment, only to be caught and trampled to a pulp by the panicked beasts. Bastard! Kyle fumed, his eyes bloodshot as he watched the smug-faced Buzzcock and his generals walk away with the rest of his men. You think we can't do anything against you? Rummaging through his space storage, the playboy searched his arsenal for a weapon that would fit the situation. A huge bazooka, looking more like an anti-aircraft turret, appeared on his shoulder. The shells lodged in the barrel's entrance emitted an eerie dark purple sheen, and even Mufasa, who was galloping nearby, gulped at the sight of this thing. After that incident, he realized that it was important to have a few trump cards in his bag. If Buzzcock hadn't taken his sister hostage, and if the Oracle didn't forbid violence in its cities, he would have simply fired a warhead at his HQ. Because of Maeve's presence, he still didn't dare let loose completely, but if it was just shooting at the refugees to return the favor, then there was no problem. And too bad, if some of them were innocent. They had chosen their side. Let's see if you have the guts to do that again after this. If you touch my sister, that's what's in store for all of you. Buzzcock and his men froze as they heard the detonation of the missile launcher firing. Coming from a primitive world, he was not yet familiar with these advanced technologies. The huge missile filled with a dark purple light looked more like a forbidden spell than the shell of a scientifically explainable weapon. Crap. Boom. A small purple mushroom that looked like a mini atomic bomb exploded to the far right of Buzzcock's faction. Those in the center, such as his sister and Buzzcock himself, were relatively spread out and had to endure only the fallout of the explosion, namely the shock wave and a shower of rubble. But for the refugees near the epicenter of the blast, death was their only salvation. A third of the refugees serving Buzzcock were vaporized out of existence, while another quarter were thrown violently to the ground, suffering terrible concussions. The weakest fainted on the spot, while the others saw stars and the world spinning around them. They were momentarily unable to get up. Will and Svara inhaled sharply as they contemplated the extent of the massacre. Looking at Kyle strangely, they congratulated themselves for never having provoked that psychopath to his limit. Otherwise, they might have joined those refugees in the afterlife. Where did these weapons come from? Svara asked with a slight tremor of fright in her voice. Will had his own idea, but he let his friend answer. New Earth's research lab. Kyle answered succinctly without taking his eyes off the enemy. Svara was confused, but Will nodded matter-of-factly. It was amazing that Kyle had managed to get those heavy weapons only hours after their third ordeal. It must have cost him quite a bit, and it proved that he was serious about saving his sister. With the deafening din of the explosion, the half-triceratops, half-bear beast that had impaled Jake reared up in terror, and he took the opportunity to kick the monster in the eye. With his monstrous vitality at work, he briefly activated bloodline ignition, and mobilizing his strength ether into his arms, he firmly embraced the creature's horn, his biceps and veins swelling under the effort, and with a quick jerk the horn snapped in half, allowing him to break free. Then, with the same horn he had plucked out of his torso, he thrust it deep into the beast's eye in retaliation. A whimper of pain pierced their eardrums, and Jake took the opportunity to kick out the beast again, this time with the reinforcement of his telekinesis. Despite the beast's mass and speed, Jake's front kick was like smacking into a solid steel wall, and its neck cracked audibly. The beast didn't die, but its abrupt stop resulted in an ugly pileup. The panicked animals behind it crashed into it, and the aftermath was like a series of dominoes collapsing exponentially. As for Jake, he used the monster as a launch pad, and the counterforce of his kick sent him flying back to his own group. "Welcome back." Kyle smiled as he put his missile launcher away. "Nice weapon you got there." Jake laughed good-heartedly, grateful to the young man for his initiative. It felt good to be avenged by someone else once in a while. Chapter 546: Chaos and Anarchy. Still, Jake didn't let the thrill of being alive cloud his judgment. As he watched the wisps of black smoke billowing skyward, his expression grew grim again. "I'm grateful that you care about my well-being, but don't do that again." He chortled to the playboy while staring somberly at the Nawai that had put him in a daze. "They didn't take you seriously before, but now even Buzzcock will have an eye on you. You may have shot yourself in the foot trying to avenge me." Kyle scratched his head sheepishly, but he didn't look repentant in the least. From the hint of a smile lingering on his face, he was actually quite proud of himself. However, as he saw the worried look in his leader's eyes, he became conscious of the true significance of his act and began to sweat profusely. "I won't do it again," he promised sincerely, but added with clenched fists right after. "However, I stand by my statement that these bastards needed a warning." Jake's eyes went wide as he received his wise words from his comrade. Was this really the same person who had just fired a mini nuke at the innocents of the enemy faction just because he thought it was fair game? Seen in this light, Kyle obviously had a more flexible morality than he did. "Perhaps I was wrong," he muttered inwardly, wondering if Buzzcock would have dared to attack him if he had promptly retaliated by lashing out at his subordinates. If Kyle could get a missile launcher of that caliber to deter his enemies, Jake didn't need it to deal massive damage. If he ditched all moral qualms and stopped trying to spare his stamina, he could do far worse than his friend when it came to wrecking the place. Of course, while they were talking, neither Jake, nor Kyle, nor Buzzcock's subordinates stopped racing forward like crazy. After the explosion, those who had been spared or were able to pull themselves up had immediately started running again, without giving a second thought to the charred, crispy black victims left for dead behind them. Jake and his group had bypassed the crater and the smoke cloud and took advantage of this interlude to widen the gap between their group and the three factions. Neither Shackler nor Melcree had reacted to their deadly exchange, and that was a huge relief to Jake and Kyle. Buzzcock had many Nawai 4 and 3 Ordeal Evolvers as subordinates, but he didn't seem to have solid control over these warriors to their utmost delight. Aside from the elegantly dressed Nawai man who had repeatedly used his soul skill against him, no one else seemed to have participated in this ambush. Seemed, because it was not unlikely for one of them to have taken the chance to cast sinister ether spells on his subordinates. The person Jake was most suspicious of, the Black Orc, on the other hand, hadn't so much as batted an eye in their direction during the entire altercation. It was as if the death of these lowly refugees, whoever their master was of no importance to him in the grand scheme of things. Nevertheless, if Jake and Buzzcock had been more attentive and not so focused on killing each other, they might have noticed the high-rank mercenary's displeased grunt when Buzzcock went after Jake. In contrast, the orc didn't raise an eyebrow when Kyle annihilated almost half the refugees in his group with his missile launcher. Only now was his upper lip curling up, revealing a long pair of ivory-colored fangs. It was hard to tell if he was smiling or gritting his teeth in fury. Now that Buzzcock had decided to leave them alone, Jake could finally focus on his wounds. Glancing hatefully at the Triceratops alien with a broken horn behind him, he promised himself he would teach it a lesson at the first opportunity. This beast was insanely tough. Even after causing a pileup and being trampled by hundreds of animals, this one had gotten up with no apparent injuries, and after a bellow had charged at him again, his eyes completely red. "You're such a sturdy beast, and yet you run from these digesters like a mouse before a cat. Whatever fucking species you're from, you bring shame to all of them." Compared to Jake, who still had time to grumble, the huge beast didn't care about the tiny human's thoughts of revenge. After this terrific kick and the loss of a horn, the creature was still disoriented and had long since entered a state of frenzy. Thanks to this, it had forgotten its fear of digesters and even experienced a surge of vigor and vitality. If not for this, how could it run so fast? This frantic escape and exchange of blows felt like an eternity, But the rocky prominence where all the factions were converging was not all that far ahead. After a minute or two of running, the dense vegetation of the forest blocking their path suddenly cleared, and they landed in a sort of barren wasteland. The place looked more like the entrance to a canyon, except that the ground was covered with an ash-gray dust. When Jake and his group stormed inside this place, thousands of refugees and evolvers already on the scene turned their eyes on them. Simultaneously, a huge flash of lightning streaked across the sky, shooting down the side of the spiral mountain that stood before them as if to herald their arrival. Seen up close, this conical structure was even more impressive than Jake had imagined. This rocky protrusion was so large and massive that the thousands of survivors at its base were like thousands of ants scurrying around their anthill. Ugh, there's actually some aliens and creatures here looking like ants. Big ants, though, Jake noticed as he swept his gaze across the crowd. Looking at one of these, he remembered his predicament, and a look of horror twisted his face. Fuck. They had been so relieved to get out of the forest and to have made it safely that they had momentarily forgotten about the rampaging beasts and digesters on their heels. Seeing this new group of survivors sprint back out of panic, the factions already there and closest to them changed their expression and drew their weapons. Just before, the factions of Buzzcock, Shackler, and Melcree had already baffled them by not stopping. Are the digesters already there? This was the question plastered on all these refugees' faces, but the strong evolvers among them sneered as they witnessed this display of ignorance. Those who cared about their subordinates had long since made their way to the mountain. Never would they have dawdled at the edge of the forest where visibility was minimal and danger paramount. The more cannon fodders between them and the horde of digesters, the better. In fact, when they tried to force their way through, whether it was the three factions or Jake and his group, they were immediately met with intense resistance. Their progress stopped after a few dozen meters, but after the last few days of carnage, these refugees were not the same cowards they once were. When other refugees blocked their path, they braced their muscles, lowered their posture, and tucked their heads into their necks before suddenly speeding up. The interfering refugees were unprepared and were knocked down like bowling pins. Although most had maxed out their strength ether stat over the past few days, they didn't have the Murtharian body and United We Stand skills to boost their performance. The result was an instant and indisputable defeat. Several evolvers at the foot of the mountain with fearsome auras glanced in their direction as they noticed the commotion. These refugees are quite okay. An old man with a rosy glow, short black hair, and a trimmed long beard stroked his chin with amusement as he saw this group of newcomers force their way through without any difficulty. Around him, there were no dingy refugees, but 100 golden-armored sturdy men with sword brows and sharp killing intent. No refugees, nor evolvers from other factions dared contend for their spot. Cannon fodders are still cannon fodders. A deep voice scoffed sinisterly in response. The speaker was a young man with long spiky black hair and blue eyes. However, his irises contained 2 golden star-shaped pupils. His skin had a healthy tan, and his proportionate musculature gave him a certain charisma. With his black armor, his long coat of the same color, and his deep blue long sword, it was difficult to mistake him with a weakling. The other owners of these huge ether signatures remained silent during their exchange. Among them were several mammoth beasts and several humanoid aliens, including a huge Nosk. There was also a mysterious woman whose face was covered by a veil. As Jake and his group crossed the first line of obstacles, the rampaging beasts chasing them emerged in turn, uprooting a bunch of trees to signify their arrival. The chaos and anarchy that ensued spoke for itself. Chapter 547 Ether Spell Fireworks. Bloody hell. What the heck is that? The eyeballs of the remaining refugees left in ignorance from the other factions bulged out as they saw this tide of enemies pouring out like an endless tide from the ash forest. It was one thing to hear the cackling of digesters drawing closer, but where did these beasts come from? Those who had scanned, scouted, or warned their comrades beforehand had long since fled, and it was the weak, panicked, and ignorant refugees who had to bear the brunt of this stampede. Jake and his group were focused on the refugees and evolvers standing in their way, but they flinched when they heard the screams of agony and terror from the refugees at their backs. Their position was not much better than that of these clueless factions. They had advanced only about 100 meters or so toward the mountain since leaving the forest. They would not make it out in time. Fuck it. Forget the previous plan. Defensive formation. Brace yourself for the impending collision. Jake shouted dully as he met the rampaging beasts behind him. The refugees from his faction were jumpy, but they were still alive today, thanks to having followed his orders so far. Gritting their teeth, they ignored the refugees and evolvers blocking their path, and turned back to face the tide of enemies bearing down on them. Fortunately for them, the evolvers and refugees barring their way were no fools either and hesitated for only a second before doing the same. The high-ranking evolvers began barking a series of commands, and some semblance of order reappeared in the midst of the panicked survivors. Nevertheless, that brief moment of indecision was enough to cause hundreds of casualties. The refugees who were closest to the forest and unprepared were trampled mercilessly before they could react, while the others were no match for the huge beasts launched at full gallop. Some resisted for a couple of seconds, but the others were immediately crushed. These deaths were not in vain, however. Their sacrifices helped slow the charge of the berserk beasts, which soon found themselves trapped in their position. This gave the other refugees time to regroup and take up a fighting position. After 1,000 deaths resulting from the initial surprise, the survivors slowly recovered their composure and started to demonstrate all they had learned during the last few days of intense carnage. These beasts were too big and heavy to be stopped head-on, but they didn't have to fight them fair. Faced with this flood of creatures, it was best to skirt around them to better attack their flanks and other vital points. It was an interesting plan on paper, but hardly applicable in reality for normal humans and aliens. Because of the 60+ ether density, their 100 ether stats did not give them a huge advantage. Their strength and agility were not even twice as good as normal. Still, with the intelligence and perception boost, some of them managed to get some results. The refugees of one faction in particular did not collapse like the others when they received the impetuous charge. Just before impact, their bodies momentarily doubled in size, their muscles and bones swelling grotesquely. Their weapons, which before seemed disproportionate in their hands, were now the right size, proof that this was no accident. The gigantism skill. Jake blurted out as he recognized Boris and Chizin's fetish technique. It was the pagan's core skill. Chizin, who he had killed during the monster game, could only change the size of one of his arms, but these refugees were doing much better. Yet, compared to Boris, who could transform himself into a gigantic titan, they looked more like adorable gnomes. Looking around at the group of refugees, he noticed a burly alien with dark horns instead of hair and thick scales all over his body reminiscent of stone. Seeing his body grow tenfold in size in the blink of an eye, he immediately identified this evolver as the faction's leader. Clearly, he had chosen to share his gigantism skill with his party. It was a good choice of first faction skill. Based on the performance of these refugees, this skill had about 20% of the power of the original. In other words, this faction was level 3. A faction leader ready to fight on the front lines with his men deserved his respect. Like a spear point cleaving through its target, the tide of monsters split in two after a short clash with them. The giant leader charged fearlessly against the beastly horde, and using a huge axe he began to tear apart the huge behemoths deigning to run at him or his men. Meanwhile, his subordinates, 4 to 5 meters tall, used their increased strength and mass to physically dominate their opponents. Using huge shields and equally heavy swords and spears, they methodically chopped their enemies without flinching. At the same time, Jake noticed that after each kill, they would take a step back and maintain their formation in good order, retreating slowly but surely. They're good. Kyle nodded with respect. They are, but we should focus on the beast before us. Will winced nervously. Why don't you try to coax them with your charisma? Svara nudged him mercilessly. She hadn't been in the gang long, but she'd seen what their vice leader was capable of during the final battle of the monster game. He had tamed quite a few creatures back then. Will's face turned ugly hearing that. Giving her a constipated look, he said, I've already tried. They're not listening to me. Their terror and determination to flee are monopolizing their willpower and attention. If I want to tame them with just my charisma, it's not impossible, but area of effect subjugation is not something easy to implement. If I don't direct the charisma ether into my voice, a specific part of my body like my eyes or my smile, it's difficult to get tangible effects on sentient creatures. For example, right now, none of you are affected by my charisma ether when we talk." Jake frowned, feeling that Will wasn't saying the whole story. He clearly remembered the influence of charisma ether on them the first time the businessman had shown them his power. It wasn't to the point of worshipping him, but even he had found Will unnaturally suave and charming at that moment. It didn't challenge his heterosexuality, but it was rather a kind of goodwill towards him, which made him trust him and forget about his physical or character flaws. Now that Will had grade 2 charisma, encoding, and other ether or soul spells to make up for his deficiencies, it was unlikely for his charisma to have no effect on these panicked beasts. Even if he couldn't completely enslave them, making them avoid their group should have been reasonably possible, right? But the reality was before his eyes. Will had no reason not to use his skills if he had a solution to their problem. Having a few secrets and trump cards was normal, but not when his life was directly threatened. Jake would have grilled Will more about it, but the small fry serving as cannon fodders in front of them had finally collapsed under the enemy charge. Having been quite hard at work for the past few days, the refugees of his faction summoned the shields Jake had forged for them, while others equipped the conventional assault rifles and bazookas that Will had granted them access to. These firearms and ammunition were normally reserved for critical moments, but this situation suited the description. "Fire at will," Jake yelled. "Fire at will." The command was repeated several times by his comrades, and a burst of bullets rained down on the rabid beasts charging at them. Several missiles were fired right after, but next to Kyle's mini-nuke these shells were not worth mentioning. Jake was wary of the refugees who had blocked their path, but they too had given up their delusional dreams and accepted that they would not make it either. Drawing their weapons as well, they took up positions at their side. Notwithstanding their brief standoff, at least one had to give them credit for not having any wimps amongst them. Inspired by the bravery of the faction leader with the gigantism skill, Jake leapt past his subordinates and swung his palms in front of him to summon a huge plasma ball. A miniature blinding star formed in his hands as all the heat from dozens of meters away was siphoned off, along with his own body heat, and then absorbed into the glowing sphere. Nearly immediately afterwards, a thundering heartbeat sound rang out in the audience's chest, and under the effect of an extreme telekinetic force the ball condensed, reducing in size by 2, then 5, and finally 10 in a split second. While performing this feat, Jake's face became covered in sweat, and the lava veins on his body dimmed slightly. Regardless, the spell was worth the effort, and his subordinates felt a deep sense of reverence as they gazed at the lethal plasma orb. Then Jake tossed it. Too bad for those scared beasts, but they didn't have to cross his path. The explosion that came next was different from the mini mushroom cloud caused by Kyle's mini nuke, but the damage to the environment was no less impressive. Boom, boom, blast. As if this first devastating explosion was a signal, the high-rank evolvers of the other factions also launched their ultimate techniques. Thunder, ice, acid, fire, and other more mysterious elements rained down on these poor beasts, instantly causing a massacre. Not to be outdone, Grash, who was the strongest of their group, roared as he leapt into the air. Seismic slash. Following his war cry, his huge sword that Jake had reforged struck down the ground, generating a huge, bottomless rift and a terrible earthquake. Chapter 548, I Can't Let You Die. For goodness' sake. Will shrieked resentfully as he lost his balance. If Shere Khan had not caught him in time with his big paw, he would probably have fallen into the rift too. Thanks, Khan. The businessman breathed a sigh of relief, his hand over his chest to calm his racing heart. When the ground stopped shaking, the giant tiger gently lowered him to the ground, and they were able to admire the extent of the mess. Grash had not done things halfway. The pig orc in question was still clutching his great sword in the same posture, the latter still sunk into the ground after his powerful cleaving move. Now, even if these panicked beasts wanted to charge at them, they would be forced to make a detour. Circling them here, even briefly, meant that the other factions would have to suffer the wrath of these creatures instead. Jake blinked stupidly as he stared at the huge, bottomless trench that parted the land in two. With his high perception, he obviously knew that this rift was not bottomless. It was just the contrast between the light above and the darkness below that gave that impression. Nevertheless, the depth of this rift was well into the 200-meter range. Pure strength couldn't accomplish that, not as cleanly anyway, even if it was a fifth ordeal player's. By deduction, it could only be an ether skill. Thinking back to their brief fight, he congratulated himself for having made a good first impression on this naive alien. Otherwise, he would have been gone by now, but Grash would most likely have been incarcerated as well for trashing in Oracle City. There was one other person, sweating profusely as he stared in horror at the aftermath of this cataclysmic attack. The scammer. Now that he saw with his own eyes what this orc jerk was capable of, he realized that he had gambled with his life by selling him that cleaning booze. "I'm sorry. Don't kill me. I won't do it again, I swear." He immediately prostrated himself at Grash's feet, whimpering loudly. "What the hell are you talking about? Why should I kill you?" The pig orc nonchalantly picked his ear with his big thumb as if he owned the place. The piece of earwax that came out was big enough to fill a small jar of honey. Holding back from vomiting, the other refugees ignored the duo and went back to fighting. "Can I do it too?" Jake muttered as he looked at his own hands. He definitely couldn't imitate Grash's method. It was an ether spell, but he had also detected traces of a soul glyph activation and another type of energy that he didn't master. On the other hand, perhaps he could use his earth and metal control skill to achieve a similar result. "Mufasa, cover me." "Sure." The huge lion agreed to stand guard in front of him. In the process, he took the opportunity to flaunt his terrifying wind roar in front of Grash. His mane of mysis began to rustle as if under the effect of an invisible wind, and a huge fan-shaped air blast shot out of his jaw. The supersonic gust blew all the beasts in its path until it ran out of steam a few miles away. At this distance, the gust was just a cool breeze and had no effect on the digesters and creatures at the back of the herd. While Mufasa and Grash were playing Who's Got the Biggest, Jake got down on one knee and closed his eyes to focus on the boundless ether he could sense beneath his feet. It was a slightly different ether than the one in the stale air around him, but he had full control over it. Yet, this ether felt wrong compared to what he was used to. Is it because we are in digester territory? Shaking off his depressing thoughts, he resumed his efforts. After tinkering with the ether underneath him using his mind, Jake was struck by a flash of understanding, and he opened his eyes suddenly. A psychic wave radiated forth from his being and seeped deep into the ground around him along with a string of commands that could not be interrupted. Only high-level evolvers, or those specializing in magic or the mind, noticed his action. Almost immediately afterwards, the ground through which the ripple passed liquefied and split in two like an ocean. This rift was less spectacular than Grash's ether skill or Mufasa's roar, but its consequences were less lasting. And yet, it was precisely this detail that frightened the onlookers nearby. Once they fell into this crack, the force holding this earth ocean and giving it its viscosity vanished. With a few swirls and splashes, the huge trench closed up, then returned to its usual solid consistency. As for the hundreds of beasts trapped forever below, no one had time to worry about them. The evolvers of the other factions had stopped saving their strength and were also unleashing their most destructive ether skills and techniques. Because of this, no one noticed Jake's pale face and sweaty forehead after using this super technique. As I thought, it's still too early for me to spam this kind of spells. Physical stamina was not the problem. His vitality and constitution was so high, especially with this ether density, that he didn't have to worry about it. He had noticed a certain issue in that department, but it wasn't to the point of troubling him. No, the real concern was his mind. In his soul status, there were no attributes like spirit constitution and vitality. His only clear gauge was his level 17 spirit body. The ether used was easy to control and replenish, but the more he used his soul and spirit body, the harder it became, and his recovery would slow down. He missed the green soul stones from his second ordeal. Spamming minor ether and soul spells was like walking for his body. Although tiring, it was nearly impossible to reach his limits unless he did nothing else for long hours. Big spells were different. It was like lifting very heavy weights or running a very long sprint. It could be done a few times, but the body always paid the price afterwards. In this case, because he had used a powerful soul skill to command the earth, he had overtaxed his spirit body for a short time. After digesting a portion of Zolver's soul stone, Jake could now project a compressed portion of his mental energy at a distance. Imbued beforehand with a series of instructions, he could finally use the full range of his spirit body without exposing himself to the slightest consequences. Of course, a spirit specialist could easily interrupt his mental waves with his own, but he would still have to be fast enough and willing to sacrifice his own soul energy. In the end, this new technique was a success, but it clearly could not be used limitlessly. Based on the subtle discomfort that ran through his spirit body, which manifested itself as a small psychosomatic headache once retracted into his brain, it would take him about 24 hours to recover from this soul skill. With the help of his other regenerative skills and soul attributes, this time could be cut in half, or even more with the right conditions. It was unnecessarily risky, what you just did. She sternly belittled him even though he hadn't asked for any of it. Huh? That spell looked pretty neat to me. Jake was puzzled by her reaction. Suppressing her discontent, she sighed and explained slowly. That spell was okay. The soul skill was okay too. The medium used was not. You have an ether soul core now. In addition to protecting your soul and spirit body, it amplifies your intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception when you merge your mind with it. This means that your mind is also more resilient and therefore better able to recover from such techniques. As long as it is not destroyed, you should also be able to recover from most mental injuries. This is your first and only physical soul organ, and you should get into the habit of storing your consciousness in it rather than in your brain. Your soul can live without your brain, but even if your body is intact, if you damage your soul, you will be no better than a vegetable. Jake didn't try to argue. He knew she was right. His only excuse was that his third ordeal had just ended, and he had only had time to test his purgatory before he had to rush out to save Kyle's sister. Since then, they had done nothing but fight and run, and he had used his free time to enter the purgatory and commence his first training module. His ether soul core and spirit body training had been left behind somewhat. Merging his mind with this ether soul core was not that easy though. He could do it, but controlling his body at the same time was counterintuitive because it had been his brain's job to do that. It would take some practice. Meanwhile, the slaughter had been ongoing, and the casualties were beginning to be staggering on both the refugee and the creature sides. Neither side was willing to die pointlessly. Although he was focused on the consequences of his technique, Jake had soldiered on and given orders for his faction to retreat in good order, until they too found their backs to the wall. With the strong factions behind them, they could not retreat any further. Just as he was about to fight to the death, something happened that changed the course of the whole battle. A frosty breath blew on the back of his neck, and he looked up to see an old man wearing a long black robe floating a few feet above him. "Sigh, I can't let you youngsters die. I need all of you living and kicking for what is coming next." Chapter 549, Death Mark. Jake could feel the ghastly and churning dark energy exuding from this old man with every breath he took. With his withered skin and gaunt build, the long, loose, unadorned black robe that this evolver floated in made him look even more emaciated than he really was, as if his body was nothing more than the fragile frame of a kite. His fingers were thin and bony, his badly trimmed nails were black with grime, while his short, slicked back hair and long beard were perfectly groomed. His face also had a rosy complexion attesting to his good health. Likewise, while the robe appeared to have been hastily sewn and dyed with poor quality wool or linen, his silver boots and the long staff in his left hand were clearly of outstanding workmanship, as evidenced by the distinctive faint blue halo enshrouding them. The staff in particular appeared to be made of ordinary wood, but the eerie shimmer of the crystalline orb embedded in its upper end belied that impression. A high-rank evolver. Jake drew a cold breath as he scanned the individual's ether levels. Highest ether stat, 35,120 points. Lowest ether stat, 4,987 points. Average ether stat, 14,285 points. The feedback was almost non-existent because of their difference in oracle rank. The only reason he was able to get so much information was because his oracle device was much more advanced than his oracle rank was supposed to warrant. However, this evolver knew how to use his ether and spirit body as a screen to stop the probing of his oracle scan. With his superior oracle rank, he could also prevent him from retrieving information about himself through the Oracle system. Ultimately, the scan was just a kind of special soul skill powered by the Oracle device's energy. It was expected that its effectiveness would eventually plateau as the power of his enemies grew. By sacrificing more ether, we might be able to get a better result, but that's not recommended. She warned him hastily as she sensed Jake's hesitation. Sensing his doubts, she added, "This evolver is a spirit specialist too. His appearance and equipment suggest that he uses some kind of magic or ether spells to fight his enemies. If so, his highest ether stat might be intelligence or extrasensory perception." Jake's face darkened as he heard She's explanation. Meeting an enemy with a strength ether stat of 35,000 points was bad enough, but 35,000 points of extrasensory perception? That totally sucked. It remained to be seen whether this evolver was an ally or an enemy. Jake found out the next moment. As it turned out, his appearance was not innocent. The digesters had finally reached the scene. The remaining refugees and beasts, including Jake and his faction, were packed like sardines into a few thousand square feet of space around the mountain. Noticing the incoming digesters, their feud suddenly seemed futile. Cornered by this common and universal enemy, they stopped killing each other and prepared for the final confrontation. Even so, many of the beasts were far too distraught and enraged to break out of their frenzy on their own. Even the imminent threat of the digesters failed to rouse them. In fact, their instinctive terror only served to heighten their madness and savagery, and the fighting resumed. The other beasts, which were just beginning to calm down, were dragged into a new fight, not against the refugees, but against their own fellow beasts. The majority of these beasts were not of the same species, nor even from the same seed world. The only reason they had seemed to collaborate was because they were fleeing in the same direction. Now that they too were cornered, the refugees were no longer their only enemy, and an indescribable mess soon broke out. It was precisely this anarchy and useless slaughter that triggered the intervention of this old man and a few other high-ranked evolvers. Watching these rampaging beasts refuse to relent, the old man sighed in a raspy voice. "I can't care less if you all die, foolish mobs, but I need you alive for the sake of my plans." It was pure scorn and condescension. This old man was not even bothering to hide his intentions. Waving about his staff, his gray eyes turned black and a sinister mental ripple spread instantly over several miles with the instantaneity of an oracle scan. Jake subconsciously shuddered as this mental wave passed through him. It was like being doused with a bucket of ice water, only much worse. Jake shielded his mind as best he could with his ether and spirit body, applying what he had learned from Zienzalver's soul stone, but he still got the unpleasant feeling that he had been contaminated by something, as if a seed had been planted inside him that was just waiting to sprout. "Death mark," she spat with disgust. "It's a necromancer." "Should I be worried?" Jake asked nervously. "Not yet. As long as you're alive, you don't have to worry." "What?" Jake bugged as he took in the meaning of her last sentence. If he was already dead, did he still have a reason to care about anything? "Look around you," she replied dispassionately. Following her advice, he found that the rabid beasts had indeed been pacified by this soul spell. The creatures and refugees were still terror-stricken, but now they seemed to fear the old man more than the digesters behind them. When the old man turned off his soul spell, this irrational fear disappeared, leaving only utmost clear-mindedness and a reverent dread towards the necromancer. But what shocked him more were the corpses of the dead refugees and creatures that sprang up like disjointed puppets after the passage of this mental ripple. A creepy glow was now shining behind their pupils or deep in their sockets when their eyeballs were missing. The fatal wounds that had claimed their lives were still there, but the nature of these corpses had changed. The souls that were destroyed, about to dissipate, or often still intact had been forced back into their bodies, but their consciousness was fading fast. A minute later, the look of these recently dead refugees and creatures had turned blank, their minds having retained only their primal instincts and some of their fighting skills. They were now undeads. This is the effect of the death mark. She shed some light on this mystery for him, not forgetting to chuckle teasingly when she caught his dumbstruck reaction. It's a curse that only works on the dead. It is harmless on the living, but is triggered by the body's clinical death. While alive, this death mark remains dormant, and even gives a slight spiritual boost, but upon the death of their host, they claim their body and soul and trigger the mutation of the latter into an undead. Is it that bad? Jake said with some doubts. It is, she confirmed solemnly. If Minerva had used a death mark on you in the third ordeal, your soul could not have returned to your body after your brain was destroyed. No matter how resilient your spirit body was, you would have been forced to forsake your original body and seek a new one. Had you tried to regain control of your now undead body, you would have become an undead yourself and your soul would have been overwritten. You could resist this death mark with a strong enough mind, but the necromancer can channel his mental force and death energy through it to bolster it. Death energy is the bane of all souls. Unless you have a huge advantage in soul energy and spirit body level, your soul will be defeated. Only, this old man is at least a sixth ordeal evolver. Winning is naturally not an option. Meanwhile, the necromancer was done with his mass subjugation. The most hilarious part of it all was that Will's eyes were bubbling with awe and wonder as he bore witness to the aftermath of this spell. "Rise, my new servants." The old man croaked apathetically as he waved his staff again. Jake relaxed as he noticed that none of his subordinates were missing, but by the look on their faces, they had all been infected by a death mark as well. Kyle's, Svara's, and Grash's faces were ugly, but they knew they were too weak to resist. Buzzcock and the other faction leaders were not doing well either. None of their evolvers had been able to fully protect themselves from this death mark. Only the Black Orc wore an indifferent expression, but with his constant angry frown it was hard to tell what he was actually thinking. Under the influence of the necromancer's magic, the undead refugees and beasts reorganized themselves with uncanny coordination and soon formed a structured army against the millions of approaching digesters. These undeads had been placed on the front lines, and the refugees' low opinion of the elder was slightly softened by this act of mercy. After all, he was under no obligation to sacrifice his new army for them. But Jake saw something else. From the old man's unsettling composure, it was as if he knew his army had nothing to fear and wanted to prevent the survivors from committing a regrettable act. Elsewhere all around the Spiral Mountain, he noticed that other high-rank evolvers had also pacified the creatures. Their methods were not as radical as those of the necromancer, but the fighting had stopped. They too did not seem alarmed by the imminent approach of the digester horde. Jake and his companions exchanged confused looks, but Grash, who was also qualified to know what was going on, relieved them by stating, "We're safe now." Bemused, the nearby refugees gave him a bewildered look, but they got their answer a few seconds later. Just as they were about to face the unstoppable charge of the millions of high-ranked digesters, the horde suddenly halted. A gasp of shock went through the camp of evolvers and refugees. Even the recently appeased beasts refrained from growling. The next thing they knew, before they had time to comprehend the absurdity of this whole thing, a rumbling sound came from within the rocky prominence behind them, and the earth began to shake. Then, as if a door had been carved into the rock, a huge crack opened in the mountain, welcoming them inside. "The dungeon digester is finally open," the old man croaked ominously. At the refugees' stunned reaction, he chuckled teasingly as he gestured to the entrance. "What are you waiting for? By all means, refugees first." Chapter 550 Dungeon Digester. Just after he said these words, his army of undeads facing the millions of digesters swung around in perfect synchrony. An ominous blue flame glinted fleetingly inside their eye sockets, and with the same unnerving coordination, they pointed their weapons at the refugees and evolvers still alive. The unarmed undead beasts camped their position, their posture prostrate, and their muscles tensed in anticipation of the impending assault. Their growls were unmistakably hostile. Jake and his companions had a brief, silent conversation using their telepathy, which resulted in a dramatic decision. Through their faction communication link, he then gave the order they had discussed. "Let's enter the mountain." The refugees from his faction hesitated briefly, but their common sense overcame their fear. The horned, scaly alien S faction using the gigantism skill also opted for the same choice. Not forgetting to cast a wary glance at the necromancer and his army of undead, they retreated in good order. Jake and the other evolvers had considered for a second the possibility of forcing their way out through the digester horde, but it only took one shot at these digesters to give up. These digesters were too strong. There were ghastly ether signatures out there amongst this horde of monsters, several hundred of which did not pale at all next to that of the old man and those other high-ranked evolvers. The hard truth was that this all-powerful necromancer had no choice either. Maybe he could fly away if he was willing to lose a few feathers, but he definitely hadn't come all this way to return empty-handed. Still, the most jarring part of all these twists and turns was by far this inexplicable truce. A few days earlier, Jake and his faction had encountered their first rank 9 digester with non-violent intentions. After completing its mysterious mission, it had left without showing any sign of hostility. And now those millions of digesters were doing the same. A few seconds earlier, they were still chasing, harassing, and slaughtering all those beasts like a pack of hungry hyenas. But now they calmly camped their positions, as if they were unable to cross an invisible barrier. The ferocity and irrational hatred of these monsters was still very much in them, as evidenced by the furious silver glow burning deep inside their eyeballs. These highly evolved digesters had little to do with the ranks 1, 2, and 3 they had fought in recent days, and their unexpected self-control made them even more chilling. The bulk of this horde was rank 5, with at least one rank 6 digester for every 10 monsters. Rank 7s were not so rare either, and Jake reckoned at least 800 rank 8 digesters just on their side of the mountain. The ultimate threat was obviously those ranks 9 and 10 digesters hidden or not in the midst of all their fellows, but Jake was comparatively more afraid of those thousands of rank 5 and 6 digesters in the forefront who were greedily eyeing them up. Many of them had chosen the humanoid evolutionary route. It was a trend he had already noticed while fighting his first rank 3 digester months earlier. Compared to these clumsy, heavy-handed opponents, these humanoid monsters had perfect control of the silver material filling their bodies. The silver chitin armor covering every inch of their flesh was intricately designed and arranged, looking more like the masterpieces of an expert blacksmith than armor hastily fashioned by brainless monsters. Their upper limbs no longer ended in silver scythes or primitive shields, but in actual hands. These still required some polishing to reach the sleekness of human hands, but they were sufficient to handle the terrible weapons they clutched firmly. These weapons were just like the chitin they wore as armor and proved that these digesters could now sacrifice their biomass to customize their own equipment. The quality and craftsmanship of the latter was like a declaration to the world of their superior sensitivity and intelligence, and it was far more terrifying than fighting stupid creatures acting only on instinct. Jake couldn't see the faces of these monsters under their smooth, visored helmets, but something in the back of his mind kept screaming at him that he wouldn't like what he found underneath. In addition to these humanoid digesters, there were also many variants that had chosen other evolutionary paths. There were thousands of elemental spitters, whose morphology had greatly diversified. This ranged from avian, insectoid, bipedal, quadrupedal, centipedal, to more unusual chimeric mutations. Depending on their talent, inspiration, and what they had ingested, these digesters had evolved in all sorts of directions, some of them very successful, while others were destined to become evolutionary dead ends. Such was the case with this rank 6 digester crawling in front of him, which looked like a malformed baby squid without tentacles. Stinking of rotting guts, this mass of gray flesh could only squeak horribly. Even his congeners refused to go near it and looked at it with despise and disgust. Yet it would never occur to Jake to underestimate this abomination. He remembered his encounter with that rank 5 slug. On the other hand, its evolved form was not an evolutionary failure at all. This silver butterfly was still the fastest digester he had even laid eyes on, and its ability to control digester hordes was a nightmarish skill. Staring at this thing, Jake was tempted to scan the horde for these butterflies, but he finally resisted his urge. If they could intercept his scan like the necromancer, then he would just be painting a red target on himself. "You're a smart kid, but don't be too smart." The old man's husky voice croaked chillingly in his head. "If you play along, I can promise you and your men will survive this ordeal." Jake's face twitched imperceptibly, but he wasn't the type to be intimidated either. He couldn't help but retort wryly. "Do you say that telepathically to all the faction leaders?" The old man's mouth stretched into a wide, creepy smile, revealing a set of perfectly aligned white teeth. As that unsightly pale blue gleam in his eyes gradually brightened in warning, He whispered. Perhaps. Jake heard it. Grash heard it. Buzzcock and the other faction leaders heard it. They all reacted the same way. It was as if they had engaged in the same telepathic conversation simultaneously and asked the same questions. Perhaps their exchange was different, but the necromancer's final answer left them with the same uneasy feeling. This old fox was definitely not a good person. With their choice made, the dozens of factions entered the spiral mountain one by one through the recently opened breach. It took several minutes before it was Jake's and his comrades' turn. Before him, the more influential and better situated factions had already begun their exploration. At least the old man didn't abandon them, unlike the other high-ranking evolvers, who immediately rejoined their groups after settling the commotion. The latter was hovering spookily above them, nonchalantly waving his mage staff to control his undead army and dissuade refugees and digesters from doing something stupid. When the last undead beast faded into the rocky prominence, the rift instantly closed as if it had never existed. The next moment, the seemingly perfectly coordinated digester horde began to cackle anarchically again, some monsters even resuming their brawling. One of the rank 10 digesters, a behemoth weighing several thousand tons and resembling a living fortress with its multiple legs, carapace and multiple silver eyes shooting purple laser beams, wherever they landed, squashed to pulp a few hundred of these disruptive digesters with a single stamp. Then another digester resembling a large wasp and hidden in the recesses of its chitin emitted a high-pitched hiss, and the digesters shuddered in fright, the more reckless ones squeaking weakly to show their protest. Their skulls exploded as a reward for their impertinence. After that, the digesters dispersed, returning to their original haunts to go about their business. The other half stayed behind, waiting for cracks like the ones that had opened the mountain to split the earth beneath their feet and swallow them up. When the fissures closed a few minutes later, there was no trace of the recent presence of this horde of millions of powerful digesters. Only footprints and evidence of fighting between the refugees and the rampaging beasts testified that a bloody battle had taken place here. When Jake and his companions crossed the gap, they were surprised that the darkness on the other side did not suffocate them. They had prepared flashlights and torches and had even prepared themselves mentally to depend on their ether vision to deal with future threats. But their precautions proved useless, and they were not unhappy about it. The inside of the rocky protrusion was a spacious cavern, but Jake was surprised to discover that the rock beneath their feet was paved, while the walls and ceiling were the result of a perfect stack of rectangular stones. The only strange thing was that these were exactly the same color as the rock forming the mountain, and these stones perfectly followed the curves of the cave walls. It was not a natural construction, but it was on the other hand completely absurd to cut the walls of the cave to obtain such a rendering. In addition to these stone walls, there were wall torches at each junction. The material of which they were made was eerily reminiscent of the silvery chitin covering the digester's flesh, and a white crystal at the top gave off a soft light that made for decent visibility. In addition to this main cavern, there were hundreds of galleries and corridors inviting them to explore the place. Even more mysterious, in front of each of these corridors was a strange white cube reminiscent of the orange cubes that abound in the Oracle cities. The impression it left on all of them was that they were in some kind of catacomb. If they still doubted it before, now they were sure. No doubts. They were standing in the belly of a dungeon digester.